The scream tore through the east wing of Ashgrave Castle before the sun had even finished rising. A young maid named Nora burst out of the nursery doors, with her cap knocked sideways, and a long scratch bleeding across her forearm. She did not stop running until she reached the main hall, where she collapsed against a stone pillar, gasping for air. "He bit me," she cried, holding up her arm for the guards to see. "The little prince bit me. I only tried to bring him his morning milk." Word spread through the castle halls faster than fire through dry grass. Within minutes, every servant in Ashgrave Castle knew that another nursemaid had failed. This made 11 in the span of 2 years. Deep inside the nursery chamber, 5-year-old Prince Kale sat curled in the corner of his bed, his small chest rising and falling with quick, ragged breaths. His golden eyes, so much like his mother's had been, glowed faintly in the dim morning light. Around him, the room was a disaster. A wooden chair lay broken near the window. Torn curtains hung from their rods. A porcelain bowl of untouched porridge had shattered against the far wall, its contents dripping slowly down the stone. Kale did not look sorry. He did not look angry either. He simply looked lost, like a small animal, trapped somewhere he did not understand, surrounded by people who did not understand him either. News of the incident reached King Damien Ashgrave, just as he was finishing his morning meeting with the castle treasurer. The moment the guard whispered what had happened, Damien's jaw tightened, and he rose from his chair so quickly that it scraped loudly against the floor. "Where is he now?" Damien asked, his voice low and controlled, though anyone who knew him could hear the storm building beneath it. "In his chamber, Your Majesty. The healer is looking at the maid's arm now. It is not serious, but she says she will not return to that room again." Damien said nothing. He simply walked, his long strides carrying him through the corridors of his own castle, like a man walking toward a battle he had already lost many times before. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, bowing their heads, none of them daring to meet his eyes. When he reached the nursery, he paused at the door for a moment. Just a moment, long enough to steady himself before pushing it open. Kale's head snapped up the instant the door creaked. For half a second, something flickered across the boy's face, something that might have been hope, or maybe just recognition. Then, just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the same wary, guarded look he gave everyone now. "Kale," Damien said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening, the way one might approach an injured wolf pup in the wild. "What happened here?" Kale did not answer. He pulled his knees tighter to his chest and turned his face away, staring at the wall instead. "She was only bringing you food," Damien continued, his voice softer now. "You cannot keep hurting the people who try to help you." Still nothing, not a word. Not since the day his mother died, 3 years ago, had Kale spoken a single sentence to anyone. He made sounds sometimes, small growls when he was frightened, quiet whimpers in the middle of the night that echoed through the corridors and kept the guards awake, but never words. The healers had checked him a dozen times and found nothing wrong with his throat, his tongue, his mind. His silence, they said, was not a sickness of the body. It was something else entirely, something none of them knew how to heal. Damien reached out a hand, intending only to rest it gently on his son's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the boy's skin, Kale flinched violently and let out a sharp, high-pitched growl, baring his small teeth in warning. The king pulled his hand back at once. He did not flinch or grow angry. He had learned, after 3 long years, that anger only made things worse. Instead, he simply sat down on the floor beside the bed, keeping a respectful distance, and remained there in silence for a long while, watching his son shake in the corner of a room that should have felt safe. This was his burden to carry. He had lost his mate, Queen Leora, to an illness the healers could never name, one that had taken her within a matter of weeks, faster than anyone could prepare for. She had been Kale's whole world. She was the one who sang him to sleep every night, the one whose laughter used to fill this very room. When she died, something inside the small boy broke along with her, and no one, not the finest healers in the kingdom, not the most patient nursemaids, not even his own father, had been able to put the pieces back together. Damien stayed with his son until Kale's breathing slowed, and his small body finally relaxed enough to lean, just slightly, against the wall. It was not affection, it was exhaustion, but Damien took what he could get. Later that afternoon, the king summoned his council to the throne room. The great hall of Ashgrave Castle was lined with tall windows that let in streams of golden light, illuminating the long table where his advisors sat waiting. Lord Varric, the king's chief advisor, rose first as Damien entered. He was a tall man with sharp features and a voice that always seemed to carry more confidence than the situation deserved. "Your Majesty," Varric said, bowing slightly. "I understand there was another incident this morning." "There was," Damien said simply, taking his seat at the head of the table. "This makes the 11th caretaker to leave in 2 years," Varric continued, his tone carrying the faintest edge of criticism. "The staff grows more frightened by the week. Soon we will have no one left willing to enter that nursery at all. I am aware of the Count, Varric. You need not remind me. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but perhaps it is time to consider other solutions. There are healers in the northern provinces who specialize in difficult children, or perhaps, if the boy cannot be managed here, a quieter estate away from the castle might." "He is my son," Damien interrupted, his voice sharp enough to silence the room. "He stays here. He stays with me." Varric bowed his head, though something unreadable passed behind his eyes before he lowered them. "Of course, Your Majesty. I only wish to see the boy cared for properly." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing matters of trade and border patrols, but Damien found it difficult to focus. His mind kept drifting back to that small corner of the nursery, to the boy curled up like a wounded animal, to the years of silence stretching endlessly ahead of them both. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains that surrounded Ashgrave Castle, Damien visited his son's chamber once more. This time, Cale was standing by the window, watching the last light fade over the hills. He did not turn when his father entered. "I brought you something," Damien said, holding out a small wooden carving of a wolf, one he had made himself many years ago, back when he still had time for such simple things. He set it gently on the windowsill beside his son. Cale glanced at it, then at his father, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Damien thought perhaps something had shifted, some small crack of light breaking through. But then Cale turned back to the window, ignoring the gift entirely, and the moment passed. Damien sighed quietly and left the room, closing the door behind him with the careful softness of a man who had grown used to disappointment. Down in the servants' quarters, word of the day's events had already become the talk of every corner of the castle. In the kitchen, an older cook named Mira shook her head as she stirred a pot of stew. 11, she muttered to the young kitchen girl beside her. 11 good women. Gone. No wages worth losing an arm over, if you ask me. They say the boy is cursed, the girl whispered, glancing nervously toward the door, as though the walls themselves might carry her words upstairs. That his mother's spirit haunts him, and that's why he won't speak, why he attacks anyone who comes near. Curses and spirits, Mira scoffed, though her voice lacked full conviction. More likely the poor child is simply grieving, in the only way he knows how. But try telling that to a girl with teeth marks on her arm. Across the castle, in a small guest chamber reserved for visiting merchants, a letter was being read by candlelight. It had arrived that morning from a distant border village, carried by a tired courier who had traveled 3 days through difficult terrain to deliver it. The letter was addressed to the head housekeeper of Ashgrave Castle, a stern but fair woman named Beatrice. The letter came from a young woman named Illyra, requesting any position available within the castle, no matter how humble. Her family's small farm near the eastern border had suffered a poor harvest that year, and with her parents both gone and her younger brother still too young to work, she needed steady wages more than ever. She wrote that she was willing to do any task assigned to her, however difficult. Beatrice read the letter twice by candlelight, tapping her fingers thoughtfully against the wooden desk. Positions in the castle were rarely available these days, not because there was a shortage of work, but because there was a surplus of fear. No one wanted the nursery position, and every other role was already filled by servants who had been with the castle for years. She set the letter aside for the night, uncertain what to do with it, though a small thought lingered in the back of her mind, one she could not quite explain. Perhaps, she thought, someone new, someone who had never heard the rumors, who carried no fear passed down from the others, might see the boy differently than they did. It was only a small thought, but sometimes, small thoughts were where the largest changes began. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Kale sat alone in the darkness that had become so familiar to him. The wooden wolf his father had left remained untouched on the windowsill, though his eyes drifted toward it every so often when he thought no one was watching. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, and somewhere far below, the castle settled into its nightly quiet. He did not cry. He had not cried since the day they told him his mother would not wake up again. Instead, he simply sat, watching the stars appear one by one through his window, waiting for a morning that never seemed to bring anything different. The castle slept that night under a heavy silence, the kind that settles over a place carrying too much sorrow for too long. But far away, in a small village near the eastern border, a young Omega named Alira lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of her family's modest home, wondering if the letter she had sent would ever receive a reply. She had heard stories, of course, faint rumors that traveled even to villages as far as hers, of a wild young prince in Ashgrave Castle who frightened away every servant who tried to care for him. She did not know if the stories were true, or exaggerated the way most castle gossip tended to be by the time it reached ordinary ears. But she found herself thinking of the boy anyway, wondering what kind of sorrow could turn a small child so wild, so untouchable. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that her letter had already been read, that a small seed of possibility had already been planted in Beatrice's mind. She did not know that somewhere in that grand and grieving castle, a lonely boy sat watching the stars, waiting, without even realizing it, for someone the whole world had already given up on finding. Nora, the young maid with the injured arm, sat in the healer's chamber, while an older healer named Petra cleaned the scratch with a damp cloth soaked in herbs. The wound was not deep, but Nora's hands still trembled from the fright of it. "He has never bitten anyone before," Petra said calmly, wrapping a thin bandage around Nora's arm. "Only scratched, and only when frightened. You must have startled him." "I only knocked and stepped inside," Nora said, her voice shaking. "He was standing so still by the window, I thought he was calm. Then I set the tray down, and he turned around, and his eyes, Petra, his eyes, looked like they belonged to something wild, not a child at all." "He is still a child," Petra said gently, though her own voice carried a note of sadness. "A grieving child no one has taught how to grieve." Nora shook her head. "I cannot go back in there. I am sorry. Truly I am. But I cannot." Petra did not argue. She had heard the same words from 10 others before Nora, and she suspected she would hear them again from whoever came next, if anyone dared to come at all. Down in the servants' quarters that evening, the older cook Mira continued her conversation with the kitchen girl as they prepared dinner for the staff. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of roasting root vegetables, a comfort against the tension that had settled over the castle since morning. "I remember when the queen was alive," Mira said, her voice softening with memory. "She used to come down here herself, you know, right into this kitchen, asking to learn how to bake the little honey cakes the boy loved so much. A queen, baking cakes with her own 2 hands. Can you imagine such a thing?" The kitchen girl shook her head in wonder. "I never met her. I came to work here only after she passed." "She had a voice like warm sunlight," Mira continued. "She used to sing while she worked, simple little songs, nothing grand, but they filled every room she stood in. The boy would follow her everywhere, humming along even before he could speak proper words. Losing her broke something in that castle that has never quite healed. Do you think the prince remembers her singing?" Mira paused, considering the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that some part of him remembers everything. That is precisely the trouble. A heart that remembers too much, with no way left to speak of what it carries, has nowhere to put its sorrow, except into fear." The kitchen girl said nothing more, but she glanced toward the ceiling, toward the distant nursery far above them, and wondered what it must be like to carry grief so heavy that words themselves refused to come. Later that night, King Damien sat alone in his private study, a room lined with tall shelves of old books, and a single fireplace that crackled softly against the evening chill. On his desk sat a portrait of Queen Leora, painted the year before her passing. Her golden hair was tied back loosely, and her eyes held the same warm kindness that Damien had fallen in love with the very first time they met. He picked up the portrait and studied it for a long moment, the way he did most nights when the castle grew quiet, and his responsibilities finally allowed him a moment of stillness. "I do not know how to reach him, Leora," he said softly to the empty room, his voice carrying the weight of 3 exhausting years. "I have tried everything. Healers, nursemaids, patience, silence. Nothing reaches him. He looks at me sometimes as though he does not even recognize his own father." The fire crackled in response, offering no answers, only warmth against the cold night air. Damien set the portrait down gently and rested his head in his hands, allowing himself, just for a moment, the exhaustion he refused to show anyone else in the castle. A king could not appear weak before his people, but alone, in the quiet of his study, he was simply a father who had failed to save his son from drowning in grief, no matter how hard he tried to pull him back to shore. Outside his study window, the night stretched long and dark over the kingdom, the same stars that Cale watched from his own window, shining down over the entire castle, indifferent to the sorrow held within its walls. Meanwhile, Beatrice, the head housekeeper, found herself unable to sleep, the letter from the young woman named Elira still resting on her desk where she had left it. She rose from her bed, lit a small candle, and read it once more, this time paying closer attention to the careful, steady handwriting, the humble but confident tone of a young woman who had clearly faced hardship without losing her resolve. There was something in the letter, Beatrice thought, some quiet strength between the lines, that reminded her faintly of the way Queen Leora used to speak, calm and unshaken, even in difficult moments. It was likely nothing more than a housekeeper's tired imagination, reaching for hope in a desperate hour. But desperate hours called for exactly that kind of hope, however small. Beatrice made her decision before the candle burned halfway down. She would write back to this Elira in the morning, and she would offer her a position, though not, she decided, in the kitchens or the laundry rooms, where the other new servants typically began. She would offer her the nursery. It was, perhaps, an unfair thing to do to a young woman who had no idea what awaited her. But Beatrice had run out of fair choices long ago. All that remained now was hope, and the quiet, persistent belief that sometimes the person no one expects is exactly the person a broken heart has been waiting for. Far from the castle, in the small eastern village where Elira lived, morning arrived with the usual sounds of rooster calls and the creak of the old wooden gate outside her family's farmhouse. Elira rose before dawn, as she always did, to tend to the few remaining chickens and check on her younger brother Finn, who was still curled beneath his blanket in the small room they shared. "Finn," she said softly, nudging his shoulder, "time to wake. The chickens will not feed themselves." Finn groaned and pulled the blanket tighter around his small frame. He was only 9 years old, too young to understand the full weight of the hardship that had settled over their little farm since their parents passed the previous winter, victims of a harsh fever that swept through the village. Elira had taken on the role of caretaker without complaint, though the burden weighed on her more heavily than she ever let show. "5 more minutes," Finn mumbled. "You said that 5 minutes ago," Elira replied, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She loved her brother fiercely, and even in the hardest mornings, moments like these reminded her why she worked so tirelessly to keep their small home together. Later that day, as she walked to the village well to fetch water, she passed by the small marketplace where traders and travelers exchanged news from distant places. She overheard 2 merchants speaking in low voices near a cart of grain sacks. "They say the young prince at Ashgrave Castle has driven away another caretaker," one merchant said, shaking his head. 11 now, I hear. The poor child must be truly troubled." "Cursed, if you ask me," the other replied. "No child behaves that way without some dark reason behind it." Elira paused for a moment, her water jug resting against her hip, listening without meaning to intrude. She had heard whispers of the wild prince before, carried along the trade roads the way most castle gossip eventually was, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But something about the way the merchants spoke, dismissing the boy as cursed rather than simply grieving, struck her as unfair. She did not know the child, nor did she know the full truth of his situation, but she found herself feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for a boy the whole world seemed ready to give up on. She continued on her way to the well, filled her jug, and returned home, the conversation lingering quietly in the back of her mind throughout the rest of her day. She had sent her letter to the castle nearly a week ago, uncertain if it would ever receive a reply, uncertain if there was even a position available for someone like her, with no experience beyond farm work and caring for her young brother. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal of vegetable stew for herself and Finn, she found herself humming an old lullaby their mother used to sing, a habit she had carried since childhood, whenever her thoughts grew heavy or uncertain. Finn looked up from his bowl and smiled. "You always hum when you are thinking hard about something," he said. "Do I?" Elira replied, a little surprised. "I had not noticed." "You do it every time. Mother used to say your humming could calm a storm." Elira laughed softly at the memory, though it carried a bittersweet weight, as most memories of her mother now did. I suppose old habits do not disappear so easily. She did not know, as she tucked Finn into bed that night, and blew out the last candle in their small farmhouse, that a letter was already being written back to her from the castle, carried by careful candlelight in the hands of a tired but hopeful housekeeper. She did not know that her simple habit of humming, something she had never thought twice was about to become the very thing that changed the course of her entire life. She only knew that morning would come again, as it always did, bringing with it another day of chores, another day of caring for her brother, another day of quiet hope that somewhere out there, a better chance was waiting for her. The next morning would bring an answer neither of them expected. The reply from Ashgrave Castle arrived 5 days later, carried by the same tired courier who had delivered Elira's original letter. Elira was gathering eggs from the henhouse when Finn came running across the yard, waving a folded piece of parchment above his head. "A letter," he shouted. "A letter came for you, Elira, from the castle." Elira's heart quickened as she wiped her hands on her apron and took the parchment from her brother's outstretched hand. She recognized the wax seal immediately, the crest of Ashgrave pressed into deep green wax. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke it open and unfolded the letter inside. The message was brief and written in a firm, elegant hand. It informed her that a position had been made available within the castle staff, effective immediately upon her arrival, and that transportation would be arranged for her within the week. It did not specify the exact nature of the position, only that housing and meals would be provided, along with fair wages, and that she should prepare to bring whatever belongings she wished to keep with her. Elira read the letter 3 times before the words fully settled into her mind. A position. Real wages. A place to live within the castle walls. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she sent her original request. "Well?" Finn asked eagerly, tugging at her sleeve. "What does it say?" "I have a position," Elira said, a mixture of relief and disbelief in her voice. "At Ashgrave Castle." Finn's excitement faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of worry. "But that means you will be far away. Who will look after me?" Elira knelt down to meet her brother's eyes, taking his small hands in hers. "Old Mrs. Hallow has already agreed to let you stay with her family whenever I need to be away. You know her, Finn. She has always been kind to us. And with the wages I earn, we will finally have enough to repair the roof before winter, and to keep proper food on the table all year round." Finn considered this for a long moment, his young mind weighing the fear of separation against the practical comfort of his sister's reasoning. "You will visit, though, when you can?" "Every chance I get," Elira promised, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I am not leaving you behind, Finn. I am doing this for both of us." The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Elira packed the few belongings she owned into a single worn traveling bag, arranged for Mrs. Hallow to look after Finn and the farm, and said her quiet goodbyes to the handful of neighbors who had become like family since her parents passed. Many of them wished her well, though a few could not resist mentioning the rumors they had heard about the troubled young prince residing within the castle walls. "Be careful up there," one elderly neighbor warned as Elira loaded her bag onto the small cart that would carry her toward the castle road. "They say strange things happen in that nursery. Best keep your wits about you." Elira thanked the woman for her concern, though privately she felt more curiosity than fear. She had spent years caring for animals on the farm who arrived frightened, injured, or simply wild from mistreatment, and she had learned that patience, more often than force or fear, was usually the key to earning their trust. Perhaps, she thought, a grieving child was not so different in that regard. The journey to Ashgrave Castle took the better part of 2 days, the cart rolling steadily along dusty roads that wound through forests and small villages, before finally climbing toward the towering stone walls that marked the castle grounds. Elira had never seen anything so grand in her life. The castle rose high above the surrounding hills, its towers catching the late afternoon sunlight, banners bearing the crest of Ashgrave fluttering gently in the breeze. When the cart finally rolled to a stop at the servants' entrance, Elira climbed down, gathering her bag and smoothing her simple traveling dress as best she could. A stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, observant eyes approached her almost immediately. "You must be Elira," the woman said, her tone measured but not unkind. "Yes, ma'am," Elira replied, offering a small, respectful bow. "And you are?" "Beatrice, head housekeeper of Ashgrave Castle. I trust your journey was not too difficult." "It was long, but manageable, thank you." Beatrice studied her for a moment, taking in the young woman's simple but clean appearance, her steady posture, the calm way she held herself despite what must have been an exhausting journey. "Come, there is much to explain before you begin your duties tomorrow." Beatrice led Elira through a maze of servant corridors, past bustling kitchens filled with the aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread, past laundry rooms where steam rose from great basins of hot water, finally arriving at a small but comfortable chamber that would serve as Elira's new living quarters. "You will settle in here tonight," Beatrice said, gesturing to the modest room with its single bed, small writing desk, and narrow window overlooking the castle gardens. "Tomorrow morning, I will introduce you to your responsibilities." "May I ask," Elira said carefully, "what exactly my position will involve? Your letter did not specify." Beatrice hesitated for the briefest moment, and Elira noticed the flicker of something cross her expression, something between caution and hope. "You will be working in the nursery," Beatrice finally said, caring for the young prince. Elira's eyes widened slightly, recalling the whispered rumors she had overheard in her village marketplace just days before. "The prince who has driven away the other caretakers?" "The very same," Beatrice confirmed, watching Elira's reaction closely. "I will not lie to you about the difficulty of this position. 11 others have come before you, all experienced, all well-trained, and all of them left within days, some sooner. The young prince has not spoken a single word since his mother passed 3 years ago. He does not respond well to strangers, and he has, on occasion, lashed out when frightened or overwhelmed." Elira absorbed this information quietly, her mind turning over the words with careful consideration rather than fear. "Is he dangerous?" "He is a frightened child who has lost the person he loved most in the world," Beatrice said, her voice softening slightly. "Whether that makes him dangerous depends, I suppose, on how you choose to approach him. If you wish to reconsider this position, I would understand completely. There is other work I could find for you within the castle." For a long moment, Elira said nothing, staring out the small window at the gardens below, where the last light of evening painted the flowers in soft shades of gold and violet. She thought of her own grief, the long months after her parents passed when words had felt impossible, when comfort from well-meaning neighbors had only made the hollow ache inside her chest feel heavier rather than lighter. She thought of how her mother's old lullabies had been the only thing that ever seemed to ease that ache, even slightly, even for a little while. "I would like to try," Elira said finally, turning back to face Beatrice with quiet determination in her eyes. "If it is permitted, I would like to meet him tomorrow." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, something like cautious hope softening the sharp lines of her face. "Very well. Rest tonight. Tomorrow will not be easy." After Beatrice left, Elira sat alone in her new chamber, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of castle life settling around her, distant voices, the creak of old wooden floors, the faint call of night birds outside her window. She unpacked her few belongings slowly, setting a small wooden carving of a bird, the last gift her father had ever given her, carefully on the writing desk beside her bed. As she prepared for sleep, her thoughts drifted toward the young prince, somewhere else within these castle walls, a boy who had lost everything familiar and safe in his world, just as she once had. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether she would fare any better than the 11 caretakers who came before her, or whether she too would find herself defeated by whatever darkness had taken hold of that small, grieving heart. But as sleep finally began to claim her, she found herself softly humming the same old lullaby her mother used to sing, the melody carrying her gently into dreams, unaware that just a few corridors away, a small boy lay awake in the darkness, listening to sounds he could not quite place, feeling, for reasons he could not explain, that something in the castle had shifted since the sun went down. Before retiring to her chamber that first night, Elira had wandered briefly through the servants' dining hall, drawn by the warm smell of fresh bread drifting through the corridor. There she met Mira, the older cook, who was wiping down the long wooden tables after the evening meal had concluded. "You must be the new girl," Mira said, looking up with curious eyes. "Word travels fast in this castle. They say you have taken the nursery position." "News certainly does travel quickly," Elira replied with a small, tired smile. "Yes, I begin tomorrow." Mira set down her cloth and studied the young woman before her for a long moment, the way an experienced cook might study an unfamiliar ingredient, uncertain yet curious about what it might become. "You are either very brave or very unaware of what awaits you." "Perhaps a little of both," Elira admitted. Mira chuckled softly at that, a warmth entering her expression that had not been there a moment before. "Sit, sit. You look as though you have traveled a great distance and eaten very little along the way." Elira gratefully accepted the offer, sitting at the long table, while Mira prepared a simple plate of bread, cheese, and warm stew from the evening's leftovers. As Elira ate, Mira continued speaking, her voice carrying the easy comfort of someone accustomed to sharing stories over a warm meal. "The boy was not always this way, you know," Mira said. "Before his mother passed, he was the sweetest child in this entire castle, always laughing, always following the queen around like a curious little shadow. It was only after she died that he changed so completely." "What was she like?" Elira asked, genuinely curious. "The queen. Kind," Mira said without hesitation. "Kinder than most nobility bothered to be toward the likes of us. She used to sing while she walked the halls, simple songs, nothing fancy, but they brought a warmth to this old castle that has not returned since she left us." The boy used to hum along beside her, even before he could speak full sentences. Elira considered this quietly, turning the information over in her mind, alongside everything Beatrice had already told her. "Do you think he remembers her singing?" Mira's expression grew thoughtful. "I could not say for certain. But grief has a strange way of settling into a person's bones, into places words cannot always reach. Perhaps some part of him remembers, even if he cannot show it." They spoke a while longer, Mira sharing small details about castle life, the routines of the kitchen staff, the personalities of the guards and other servants Elira would soon come to know. By the time Elira finally excused herself to retire for the evening, she felt slightly less like a stranger within these unfamiliar stone walls, and slightly more prepared for whatever awaited her the following morning. Walking back toward her chamber, she passed beneath a long corridor, lined with portraits of the Ashgrave family, generations of kings and queens gazing down from their gilded frames. She paused before one particular portrait near the end of the hallway, depicting a golden-haired woman with warm, kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to radiate even from the painted canvas. A small plaque beneath the frame read simply, "Queen Leora Ashgrave, beloved mother and wife." Elira studied the portrait for a long moment, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for a woman she had never known, for a family torn apart by a loss no one could have prevented. She thought of her own mother, gone now nearly a year, and the aching hollow that grief had carved into her own heart during those first difficult months. Perhaps, she thought, grief was not so different whether it belonged to a farmer's daughter or a young prince. Perhaps sorrow, in its purest form, cared nothing for titles or crowns, and struck every heart with the same unbearable weight. She continued on toward her chamber, the portrait's kind eyes lingering in her memory long after she had passed beyond its gilded frame, and settled into her narrow bed, beneath an unfamiliar ceiling, in a castle that already felt heavier with sorrow than any place she had known before. Sleep did not come easily that first night. Elira lay awake for a long while, listening to the distant sounds of the castle settling around her, the occasional call of a night guard changing posts, the soft creak of old wooden beams shifting in the evening chill. Her mind kept drifting back to the young prince, somewhere within these walls, wondering what kind of darkness could take hold of a child so completely that he could no longer find his own voice. She thought of her brother Finn, safely tucked away at Mrs. Hallow's home many miles from here, and hoped he was sleeping peacefully, unaware of how much she already missed his presence beside her. She thought of her parents, gone now but never forgotten, and found herself whispering a quiet prayer into the darkness, asking for whatever small courage she might need to face the challenge waiting for her when morning arrived. Eventually, exhaustion won out over her wandering thoughts, and sleep finally claimed her, carrying her into dreams filled with half-remembered lullabies and the faint, distant sound of a child's laughter that did not yet belong to anyone she knew. Morning arrived quickly, carrying with it the weight of uncertainty and the quiet promise of a chance neither Alira nor Cale yet understood they desperately needed. Alira woke before dawn, as had always been her habit on the farm, and dressed carefully in the simple gray uniform Beatrice had left folded at the foot of her bed the previous evening. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washing basin, taking a steadying breath before making her way toward the servants' dining hall for a quick morning meal. Beatrice met her there promptly, her expression unreadable as she led Alira through the winding corridors of the castle, climbing several flights of stairs until they reached the east wing, where the nursery chamber stood at the end of a long, quiet hallway. "Before we go further," Beatrice said, pausing outside a heavy wooden door, "I must prepare you properly. The prince has not spoken since his mother's passing 3 years ago. He does not respond to direct commands, and he grows agitated easily when approached too quickly, or touched without warning. The previous caretakers made the mistake of treating him as though patience alone would fix everything within a single day. It will not. If you truly intend to help him, you must be prepared for a long and difficult road, one that may show little progress for weeks, perhaps even longer." Alira nodded, absorbing every word carefully. "I understand." "Do you?" Beatrice asked, studying her closely. "Understand, truly? Or do you simply believe you understand, because you have not yet seen him?" The question caught Alira slightly off guard, though she did not look away. "I lost my own parents last winter, Mrs. Beatrice. I know something of grief, of what it feels like when words become too heavy to carry. I cannot promise I will succeed where others have failed, but I promise I will not give up simply because the path proves difficult." Something in Beatrice's expression softened at that answer, though she said nothing further on the matter. Instead, she reached for the heavy iron handle of the nursery door. "Remember, move slowly, speak softly, if you speak at all, and above all else, do not force him toward anything he is not ready to give." With that, Beatrice pushed the door open and stepped aside, allowing Alira to enter the chamber alone. The nursery was larger than Alira had expected, though the signs of past struggles were evident throughout the room. A broken chair had been pushed into one corner, waiting for repair. Deep scratches marked the wooden bedpost. The curtains, though recently replaced, hung slightly crooked from their rods, as though someone had grabbed at them in a moment of panic not long ago. In the far corner of the room, seated on the floor with his back pressed firmly against the wall, sat Prince Cale. He looked smaller than Alira had imagined, his dark hair falling messily across his forehead, his golden eyes tracking her every movement with sharp, wary attention. His small hands were curled into loose fists resting against his knees, and his entire posture radiated the tense readiness of a creature prepared to flee or defend itself at the slightest provocation. Alira paused, just inside the doorway, careful not to move any closer than necessary. She said nothing at first, simply allowing him a moment to study her the way she studied him, two strangers assessing one another across the quiet distance of an unfamiliar room. "Hello, Cale," she said softly, her voice gentle and unhurried. "My name is Alira." Cale's eyes narrowed slightly at the sound of his own name, though he made no move to respond, verbally or otherwise. His gaze remained fixed on her, cautious and unblinking. Alira did not attempt to move closer. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to the floor near the doorway, sitting cross-legged, with her hands resting calmly in her lap, deliberately placing a respectful distance between herself and the frightened child across the room. She had learned, through years of caring for injured or frightened farm animals, that the worst thing one could do to an already overwhelmed creature was to close the distance too quickly, to demand trust before it had been earned. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Cale watched her with unwavering suspicion, clearly expecting her to eventually approach him the way every other caretaker had, with false cheerfulness and forced closeness he was not ready to accept. When she did not move, when several long minutes passed with Alira simply sitting quietly across the room, something in his rigid posture seemed to loosen, just slightly, though his guarded expression remained firmly in place. Alira began to hum softly, the same old lullaby her mother used to sing during difficult evenings on the farm. A simple melody, with no particular words attached to it, just a gentle rise and fall of sound that had always brought her comfort during her own hardest moments. Cale's head tilted slightly at the sound, his sharp eyes narrowing with something that looked less like suspicion now and more like curiosity. He did not move from his corner, but his posture shifted, his tightly curled fists relaxing slightly against his knees. Illyra continued humming, careful to keep her voice soft and steady, never rushing the melody, never forcing it louder or more insistent than it needed to be. She kept her eyes lowered respectfully, not staring directly at the boy, allowing him the space to observe her without feeling cornered or watched too closely. Minutes passed in this manner, the quiet melody filling the tense silence of the nursery chamber. Slowly, cautiously, Cale's shoulders began to lower from their defensive hunch. His breathing, which had been quick and shallow when Illyra first entered, gradually deepened into a steadier, calmer rhythm. Illyra noticed the change but did not react outwardly, continuing her gentle humming without pause, without acknowledgement of the small progress unfolding before her. She understood, instinctively, that drawing attention to the shift might frighten him back into his defensive posture. After what felt like nearly half an hour, though it may have been less, Cale's rigid stillness finally broke. He shifted his position slightly, pulling his knees a fraction closer to his chest, but angling his body just slightly more toward her rather than away. A small, almost imperceptible movement that nonetheless carried enormous significance. Illyra allowed herself the faintest smile, though she kept her humming steady and unchanged, careful not to disrupt whatever fragile trust was beginning to form in that quiet corner of the room. Eventually, the melody drew to its natural close, and Illyra let the silence settle gently over the room, rather than filling it immediately with words. She waited, patient and unhurried, watching Cale's reaction from the corner of her eye. To her surprise, after a long stretch of silence, a small, barely audible sound emerged from the boy's corner. Not words, not yet, but a soft, tentative hum, following the faint echo of the melody Illyra had just finished singing, clumsy and uncertain, but unmistakably an attempt to continue the tune she had begun. Illyra's heart swelled with a quiet, cautious hope she dared not express too openly. Instead, she simply began humming again, softer this time, allowing her voice to blend gently alongside his hesitant attempt, neither leading nor correcting, simply accompanying him in whatever small step he was willing to take. They continued this way for a long while, two quiet voices humming an old, wordless lullaby across the careful distance of a grieving nursery, until the tension that had gripped the room since Illyra's arrival finally began to ease into something softer, something that almost resembled peace. Outside the nursery door, Beatrice stood listening, her hand still resting lightly against the heavy wooden frame, her sharp eyes widening with quiet disbelief at the sound drifting faintly through the thick door. In 11 previous attempts, no caretaker had lasted even a full hour within that chamber without incident. Yet here, on the very first morning, something entirely different seemed to be unfolding. She did not dare open the door to check, fearing that any interruption might shatter whatever fragile progress was taking place. Instead, she simply stood quietly in the hallway, listening to the faint, imperfect harmony drifting through the wood, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a small measure of genuine hope. By midday, Illyra had still not moved from her position near the door, though the distance between herself and Cale had slowly, gradually narrowed over the passing hours. He remained wary, still unwilling to speak, still flinching slightly whenever she shifted position too quickly, but he no longer retreated fully into his defensive corner each time she moved. He no longer growled or bared his teeth at her presence. When a tray of food arrived at midday, carried nervously by a young kitchen boy who refused to step fully into the room, Illyra accepted it herself and carried it slowly toward Cale, setting it down a respectful distance away, rather than pressing it directly into his space. She retreated back to her original spot afterward, resuming her position and her quiet, patient presence. Cale eyed the tray suspiciously for several long minutes, before finally, cautiously, reaching for the bread resting atop it, eating in small, careful bites, while never fully taking his eyes off Illyra across the room. It was not a victory, not yet. There would be many more difficult days ahead, many more moments of fear and uncertainty for them both to navigate. But as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the nursery floor, and Cale finished his simple meal without a single outburst, Without a single flash of panic or defensive aggression, Elira allowed herself to believe, just slightly, that perhaps this fragile beginning might grow into something more. When evening finally arrived, and Beatrice returned to check on them, she found Elira still seated calmly near the door, and Cale curled peacefully on his bed nearby, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of actual, restful sleep, something none of the previous caretakers had ever witnessed during their brief and troubled time within these walls. News of the day's events reached King Damien just as he was finishing his evening duties in the council chamber. A young guard approached him hesitantly, unsure how to phrase what he had heard from the servants below. "Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing slightly. "I thought you should know." The new caretaker, the young woman named Elira, she remained in the nursery the entire day. "Mrs. Beatrice says the young prince fell asleep peacefully this evening, without any disturbance at all." Damien looked up sharply from the documents on his desk, certain he had misheard. "The entire day? Without incident?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Mrs. Beatrice witnessed it herself just moments ago." Damien set down his quill slowly, a strange mixture of disbelief and cautious hope stirring within his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in longer than he could remember. 11 caretakers, each carefully selected, each experienced and well-trained, had failed within days, some within hours. What could this young woman, a stranger with no prior experience in royal households, possibly have done differently? "Where is she now?" Damien asked. "Retired to her chamber for the evening, Your Majesty. Mrs. Beatrice thought it best not to disturb either of them further tonight." Damien nodded slowly, dismissing the guard with a quiet word of thanks. Alone once more in his study, he found himself staring at the flickering candlelight, turning the guard's words over carefully in his mind. He wanted desperately to believe that something had truly shifted, that perhaps his son's long isolation might finally be nearing its end. Yet 3 years of disappointment had taught him the danger of hope offered too freely, too quickly, only to be crushed again, in the days that inevitably followed. Still, despite his caution, a small, stubborn flicker of hope refused to be extinguished entirely. Meanwhile, in a private chamber elsewhere in the castle, Lord Varric received the same news from one of his own informants among the household staff, a nervous young footman who reported directly to him in exchange for small favors and occasional coin. "The entire day," Varric repeated, his brow furrowing with something between skepticism and calculation. "No incidents at all?" "None reported, my lord. The girl simply sat with him, sang to him, and somehow he calmed." Varric dismissed the footman with a curt wave, remaining alone in his chamber as he considered this unexpected development. For 2 years, the king's inability to secure a stable caretaker for his troubled son had provided Varric with useful leverage, subtle arguments suggesting that perhaps the boy required specialized care far from the castle, arguments that conveniently aligned with certain political marriages Varric had quietly been arranging on the king's behalf, unions that would strengthen the kingdom's borders and, not incidentally, strengthen Varric's own influence within the court. A stable, healed prince complicated matters considerably. A father no longer burdened by desperate worry over his son's well-being might feel far less inclined to accept the political marriages Varric had been carefully cultivating for months. This new caretaker, whoever she was, represented an unexpected obstacle to plans that had taken considerable time and effort to arrange. Varric resolved to learn more about this young woman named Elira before drawing any further conclusions. Perhaps her success was merely a fortunate first day, one that would collapse under its own weight soon enough, just as the others eventually had. Or perhaps, he considered with growing unease, she represented a genuine threat to carefully laid plans that had taken far too long to arrange to be abandoned now. Either way, he decided, it would be wise to watch her closely in the days ahead. Back in the nursery, long after Beatrice had closed the door and retired for the evening, Cale stirred briefly in his sleep, his small hand reaching instinctively toward the empty space beside his bed, where, years ago, his mother used to sit until he drifted fully into peaceful dreams. Finding nothing there, he shifted restlessly for a moment, before settling again, his breathing evening out once more, into the steady rhythm of undisturbed rest. Down the hall in her own modest chamber, Elira lay awake, reflecting on the day's events, her mind replaying the small, fragile moments of progress she had witnessed. The tentative hum that had followed her own melody, the way his shoulders had gradually lowered from their defensive posture, the simple, uneventful act of him eating his meal without fear or aggression. She understood clearly that this was only the very beginning of a long and uncertain path ahead. Trust, once broken as deeply as his had been, could not be rebuilt within the span of a single day, regardless of how promising that day had been. There would likely be setbacks, difficult moments where old fears resurfaced, days when progress seemed to reverse itself entirely. She had witnessed similar patterns often enough, with frightened animals on the farm, to understand that healing rarely followed a straight, uninterrupted path. Yet despite this cautious understanding, she allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction as she finally drifted towards sleep, comforted by the thought that somewhere down the hall, a small, grieving boy had fallen asleep peacefully for what might have been the first time in longer than anyone could properly remember. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. But for tonight, at least, something small and fragile had begun to shift within the walls of Ashgrave Castle, a quiet thread of hope woven carefully between two people who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that grand and grieving place, exactly what it felt like to lose someone whose absence could never truly be filled. Beatrice said nothing as she gently closed the door, leaving the boy to his rest, but the quiet astonishment on her face spoke more than words ever could. The days that followed settled into a quiet, careful rhythm within the nursery walls. Each morning, Alira arrived shortly after dawn, always announcing her presence softly before entering, always giving Cale a moment to prepare himself for her arrival, rather than surprising him the way earlier caretakers unknowingly had. Each evening, she remained until he settled into sleep, never rushing him toward closeness, never demanding more than he seemed ready to give on any particular day. Progress came slowly, in small, uneven steps. On the third day, Cale allowed her to sit only an arm's length away, rather than across the room, watching her closely as she worked on mending a small tear in one of his shirts, rather than staring directly at him. On the fifth day, when a sudden clap of thunder startled him badly enough to send him scrambling toward the corner of his bed, he did not push her away when she moved closer, offering quiet reassurance through her steady humming, rather than words he might find overwhelming. By the end of the first week, something had shifted noticeably in the atmosphere of the nursery. The broken furniture had finally been repaired without incident. The curtains hung straight and undisturbed. Cale no longer flinched violently at the sound of the door opening each morning, though he remained cautious, watchful, still testing the boundaries of this fragile new arrangement. One evening, as golden light spilled through the nursery window during the quiet hour before sunset, Alira sat mending a small wooden toy that had broken sometime during Cale's earlier days of distress. She hummed softly as she worked, the familiar melody filling the comfortable silence between them. Cale, seated nearby on the floor with a small collection of smooth stones he had taken to arranging in careful patterns, glanced up at her from beneath his messy dark hair. His golden eyes studied her with an intensity that had softened considerably since their first difficult meeting, curiosity replacing much of the wariness that once dominated his every expression. Alira noticed his attention and offered a small, warm smile, careful not to make him feel overly observed. "Do you like this song?" she asked gently, continuing her work without pressing him for an answer. Cale did not respond verbally, as she had come to expect, but he tilted his head slightly, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words might have. Alira had learned, over the past week, to read these subtle movements carefully, understanding that his silence did not mean the absence of communication, only a different language entirely, one built from small gestures, careful glances, and the gradual softening of a once rigid posture. "My mother used to sing it to me," Alira continued softly, setting the mended toy carefully within his reach, without forcing him to take it immediately. "When I was frightened, or sad, or simply could not sleep," she said, "songs carry feelings that words sometimes cannot properly hold." Cale's eyes flicked briefly toward the small wooden wolf carving still resting on his windowsill, the gift his father had left days earlier that he had not yet touched. Something flickered across his young face, quick and difficult to interpret, before he returned his attention to the stones arranged carefully before him. Alira noticed the glance but said nothing further, allowing the moment to pass without comment, understanding instinctively that pushing too directly toward difficult memories might undo the careful trust they had built over the past several days. That night, after Kale had finally drifted into sleep, Elira remained seated quietly beside his bed for a while longer than usual, watching the steady rise and fall of his small chest, the peaceful expression that had slowly begun replacing the tense wariness that once defined even his resting moments. She thought of her own difficult months following her parents' passing, the long nights when sleep felt impossible, when grief pressed so heavily against her chest that breathing itself seemed like an overwhelming task. She understood, in ways few others within the castle could fully appreciate, exactly what this small boy carried within him, the particular weight of a loss too large for a young heart to properly process or express. Perhaps that shared understanding, more than any particular skill or technique, was what allowed her to reach him where so many others, however well-intentioned, had failed. As she finally rose to leave for the evening, careful not to disturb his peaceful sleep, she noticed something that made her pause near the doorway. The small wooden wolf carving, previously untouched on the windowsill for days, had been moved. It now rested on the small table beside his bed, positioned carefully within his reach, close enough that his fingers, even in sleep, rested lightly against its smooth wooden surface. Elira felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the small, quiet discovery. It was not proof of dramatic healing, not evidence that his deep grief had suddenly resolved itself, but it was something, a small, tender gesture suggesting that perhaps, somewhere beneath the wariness and silence, a small boy was slowly beginning to remember what it felt like to reach toward comfort rather than retreat from it. She closed the door softly behind her, carrying that small hope with her through the quiet castle corridors toward her own chamber, unaware that a similar hope had begun stirring, cautiously and carefully, within the heart of the king himself, who had taken to watching quietly from a distance, unwilling yet to interrupt whatever fragile healing seemed to be unfolding within his son's once broken world. Word of the gradual changes continued spreading through the castle staff over the following days, carried in hushed, hopeful whispers between servants who had witnessed firsthand the transformation taking place within the nursery walls. Nora, the maid who had been injured during that first difficult morning, found herself genuinely surprised one afternoon when she passed the nursery corridor and heard, faintly through the door, the unmistakable sound of quiet, contented humming, two voices intertwining gently, rather than the tense silence or sudden outbursts that had once defined that space. She paused for a long moment outside the door, listening with a mixture of disbelief and quiet relief, before continuing on her way, carrying the small hopeful news back to the kitchen staff, who received it with the same cautious optimism that had begun spreading throughout the entire castle. Even Beatrice, normally reserved and measured in her assessments, found herself allowing small moments of genuine hope to surface as she observed the steady, if gradual, progress unfolding within the nursery each day. She had seen too much disappointment over the past 3 years to celebrate prematurely, but she could not deny the evidence steadily accumulating before her own careful, watchful eyes. Not every day passed without difficulty, however. On the 10th day since Elira's arrival, a sudden commotion in the corridor outside the nursery sent Kale retreating instantly into his old defensive posture, curling tightly against the wall with his teeth bared in warning. A group of visiting nobles, touring the castle grounds ahead of an upcoming banquet, had passed too closely to the nursery door, their loud, unfamiliar voices carrying sharply through the thin wood. Elira moved carefully, positioning herself between Kale and the door without touching him, without crowding his space, simply providing a calm, steady presence between him and whatever threat his frightened mind perceived beyond the walls. She began humming immediately, softly at first, then slightly louder, as the voices outside continued their careless chatter, gradually drawing his frightened attention away from the unfamiliar sounds and back toward the familiar comfort of her voice. It took nearly 20 minutes for Kale's rapid breathing to slow, for the tension gripping his small body to finally ease. When the corridor outside finally fell silent again, he remained curled against the wall for a while longer, exhausted from the surge of fear that had gripped him so suddenly. Elira did not rush him afterward, understanding that setbacks, however small, were simply part of the difficult path they were navigating together. She remained seated quietly nearby until his breathing returned fully to normal, until his rigid posture finally relaxed enough for him to uncurl from his defensive position. "You are safe here," she said softly, careful to keep her voice calm and even. "I will not let anything frighten you while I am here." Kale did not respond with words, as she had come to expect, but his golden eyes met hers directly for a long moment, something raw and vulnerable flickering behind his guarded expression, before he looked away again, retreating slightly into himself, but no longer trembling with fear. Later that evening, Elira mentioned the incident to Beatrice, careful to frame it not as a failure, but as useful information about the particular sounds and situations that seemed to trigger his distress most severely. Loud, unfamiliar voices seemed to frighten him more than most other sounds, Elira explained. Perhaps because he cannot predict them, or place them within anything familiar. Beatrice nodded thoughtfully, making a mental note to speak with the castle steward about keeping visiting guests further from the East Wing corridors in the future. "You are learning him quickly," she observed. "Faster than any of the others managed." "I am not doing anything particularly clever," Elira replied honestly. "I am simply paying attention, and giving him room to feel what he feels, without demanding he hide it or rush past it before he is ready." "That," Beatrice said quietly, "is precisely what the others failed to understand." The following morning, King Damien found himself once again drawn toward the East Wing, unable to fully resist the quiet curiosity that had taken hold of him since first learning of the changes unfolding within his son's world. He paused outside the nursery door, listening carefully before knocking, a habit he had begun practicing since Elira's arrival, mindful of Beatrice's earlier warnings about sudden interruptions. When Elira opened the door and saw the king standing in the corridor, she offered a respectful bow, stepping aside to allow him entry. Kale, seated near the window with his collection of smooth stones, glanced up briefly at his father's arrival, before returning his attention to his careful arrangement, though Elira noticed his shoulders had not tensed the way they once did whenever Damien entered the room. "He has not reacted so calmly to my presence in quite some time," Damien observed quietly, moving carefully into the room, mindful not to approach too quickly. "He is learning that not every sudden presence brings danger with it," Elira replied gently. "It will take time, but I believe he is beginning to trust that this room, at least, is a safe place." Damien lowered himself slowly to the floor, a respectful distance from his son, watching as Kale continued arranging his stones with quiet concentration. "May I ask," he said, turning toward Elira, "how you managed what so many others could not?" Elira considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not believe I did anything particularly special, Your Majesty. I simply tried to understand what he needed, rather than what I believed he should need. Grief does not follow rules or timelines set by those observing it from the outside. It asks only for patience, and the freedom to be felt without judgment." Damien studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and slightly wistful passing behind his tired eyes. "You speak as though you understand this from experience, not merely observation." "I lost my parents last winter," Elira said simply. "I understand, perhaps better than most, how heavy silence can become, when there are no words large enough to hold what a person feels inside." Damien said nothing further for a long while, simply watching his son continue his quiet task, absorbing the quiet wisdom in the young woman's words. When he finally rose to leave, he paused once more at the doorway, turning back toward Elira with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving him room to heal in whatever way he needs." Elira bowed her head respectfully as he departed, then returned her attention to Kale, who had paused his stone arranging to watch his father's retreating figure disappear through the doorway, an unreadable expression lingering briefly on his young face, before he returned once more to his careful, patient work. Something had truly begun to change within Ashgrave Castle, slowly, carefully, one quiet song at a time. 2 more weeks passed, and with them came changes so gradual that only those watching closely could truly appreciate how far Kale had come since Elira's arrival. He no longer flinched at the sound of the nursery door opening each morning. He had begun accepting her presence beside him during meals without hesitation, sometimes even nudging a piece of bread toward her, a small, wordless gesture of sharing that brought unexpected warmth to Elira's heart each time it occurred. King Damien found himself visiting the nursery more frequently now, drawn by a curiosity that had slowly transformed into something resembling cautious hope. He began arriving in the early evenings, after his council duties concluded, sitting quietly nearby, while Elira worked through whatever gentle activity had captured Kale's attention that particular day. whether arranging stones, mending small toys, or simply listening to her soft, familiar humming fill the quiet room. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping cooler air through the castle corridors, Damien arrived earlier than usual, pausing at the threshold of the nursery door before entering. Through the narrow gap, he observed a scene that stopped him entirely in place. Cale was seated on the floor beside Alira, his small body leaning slightly against her side, his head resting against her shoulder as she hummed softly, her fingers gently combing through his messy dark hair in slow, soothing strokes. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and peaceful, utterly relaxed in a way Damien had not witnessed since before his wife's passing. Damien remained frozen at the doorway, unwilling to disturb the tender scene unfolding before him, his chest tightening with an emotion he could not immediately name. It was relief, certainly, but also something sharper, something that stirred memories of his late wife, sitting in that very same position, humming that very same melody, his son curled peacefully against her side, in exactly the manner he now witnessed, with this quiet, unassuming young woman, who had somehow succeeded, where an entire kingdom's resources had failed. He did not enter the room that evening. Instead, he simply watched for a long, quiet moment, allowing himself the rare luxury of hope, without immediately questioning or doubting it, before retreating silently back down the corridor, leaving father and healer, though he had not yet begun thinking of her in such terms, to their peaceful moment undisturbed. That night, alone in his study once more, Damien found himself studying his late wife's portrait, with different eyes than he had in longer than he could remember. For the first time since her passing, the ache in his chest felt slightly less hollow, tempered by the quiet, growing hope that perhaps his son's healing, so long feared impossible, was truly beginning to take root. "You would like her," he said softly to the portrait, a small, unfamiliar smile touching the corner of his mouth. "She sings the same songs you used to sing him. I do not know how she found her way to us, but I am grateful every single day that she did." The following weeks brought increasingly frequent interactions between the king and the young caretaker who had transformed his son's world so quietly and completely. Damien began seeking her counsel on small matters concerning Cale's care, asking her opinion on decisions he once would have left entirely to healers and advisors. Their conversations, initially formal and reserved, gradually softened into something more comfortable. Two people bonded by shared concern for a child they had both come to love in their own particular ways. "He asked me something today," Alira mentioned one evening, as Damien sat nearby watching Cale sleep peacefully in his bed. Not with words, of course, but he pointed toward the garden outside his window, then toward himself, then toward the door. "I believe he wished to know if he might go outside sometime." Damien's eyebrows rose with surprised interest. He has not shown interest in leaving this room in over a year. "Perhaps he is ready for small steps beyond these walls," Alira suggested carefully. "With appropriate caution, of course. Nothing overwhelming or sudden." "I could arrange for a private section of the garden to be cleared for him," Damien offered thoughtfully. "Away from the busier areas, where visiting nobles or unfamiliar staff might startle him." "That would be wonderful," Alira said, her genuine warmth evident in her expression. Small, familiar spaces first. Perhaps eventually, he might feel comfortable exploring further. Damien studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded softening his usually composed expression. "You truly believe he can recover fully, don't you? Not simply become manageable, but genuinely heal." "I do," Alira said with quiet conviction. "Grief like his does not disappear entirely, Your Majesty. I do not believe mine ever fully will either. But it can soften. It can become something a person learns to carry, rather than something that crushes them entirely. I have seen it happen in him already, small as those changes might seem to others." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing her words with the same careful attention he gave to matters of state, though this conversation carried far more weight for him personally than any council meeting ever could. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay," he said quietly. "You have given me back pieces of my son I feared were lost forever." "You owe me nothing, Your Majesty," Alira replied, a faint blush coloring her cheeks at his sincere gratitude. "I have grown genuinely fond of him. Whatever progress he has made through his own quiet courage. I have simply tried to give him space to find it." Their eyes met for a moment longer than perhaps either of them intended. something unspoken passing between them before Alira looked away, returning her attention to the sleeping child nearby, and Damien cleared his throat softly, rising to take his leave for the evening. As autumn deepened into its cooler weeks, the private garden section Damien had promised was completed, a small, enclosed space filled with fragrant herbs, colorful late-season flowers, and a gentle stone path winding beneath sheltering trees. Alira brought Kale there for the first time, on a mild, sunny afternoon, watching carefully for any signs of overwhelming distress as they stepped beyond the familiar nursery walls, for the first time in longer than either of them could properly recall. Kale paused at the garden entrance, his small hand tightening slightly around Alira's fingers, his golden eyes scanning the unfamiliar space with cautious uncertainty. Alira knelt beside him, keeping her voice calm and reassuring. "We can return inside whenever you wish," she said softly. "There is no rush. We are only exploring a little today." Kale remained still for a long moment, absorbing the new sights and sounds surrounding him, the gentle rustle of leaves overhead, the distant chirping of birds, the soft fragrance of late-blooming flowers carried on the cool afternoon breeze. Slowly, cautiously, he took a single step forward, then another, his grip on Alira's hand loosening slightly, as his initial wariness gradually gave way to quiet curiosity. By the time the afternoon light began softening toward evening, Kale had wandered nearly the entire length of the small garden path, pausing occasionally to examine interesting stones or fallen leaves, his small face carrying an expression of genuine, unguarded wonder that Alira had never witnessed before during their weeks together. Watching from a distant window, Damien observed this small, precious scene unfold, with tears he did not bother hiding, standing entirely alone in his private study, overwhelmed by gratitude for a young woman who had walked into his broken family and, through nothing more than patience and quiet compassion, had begun rebuilding what he had long believed was beyond any possible repair. He did not yet fully understand the depth of feeling beginning to take root within his own heart, feelings that extended beyond simple gratitude into territory far more complicated and far more dangerous for a grieving king still bound, in the eyes of his court and his kingdom, to the memory of a wife he had loved completely. But as he watched his son laugh silently at a fluttering butterfly, watched Alira's warm, encouraging smile as she knelt beside him sharing in his quiet joy, Damien allowed himself, for just a moment, to imagine a future he had long believed impossible, one where laughter and light might finally return permanently to the halls of Ashgrave Castle. It was a dangerous hope to carry, he knew, given everything that still stood unresolved between grief and duty, between his responsibilities as king and the quiet longing beginning to stir within his own healing heart. But for the first time, in 3 long, difficult years, hope felt worth the risk of carrying forward. News of the prince's garden walk spread through the castle with remarkable speed, carried first among the household staff, then eventually reaching the ears of the visiting nobles who had gathered for the upcoming autumn banquet. Whispers of the transformation taking place within the royal nursery became the primary topic of conversation among courtiers who had grown accustomed, over the past 3 years, to speaking of the young prince only in hushed, pitying tones. Lord Varric heard these whispers with growing unease. He had hoped, quietly, that the young caretaker's initial success might prove temporary, a fortunate but ultimately unsustainable beginning that would eventually collapse the way so many previous attempts had. Instead, with each passing week, the reports grew more remarkable rather than less, and the king himself seemed increasingly invested, both in his son's recovery and, Varric suspected with growing concern, in the young woman responsible for it. He raised the matter carefully during a private council session, choosing his words with the practiced precision of a man accustomed to steering conversations toward his preferred conclusions, without appearing to do so directly. "Your Majesty," Varric began, "the kingdom rejoices at Prince Kale's improvement. It is truly a blessing none of us dared hope for so soon." "It is," Damien agreed, his tone carrying none of the guarded caution he typically reserved for conversations with his chief advisor. "I wonder, however," Varric continued delicately, "whether it might be wise to formalize the young woman's position more officially, perhaps assign additional oversight, ensure proper protocols are followed as the prince continues his recovery. We would not wish for informal arrangements to create complications as his condition improves and his royal duties eventually resume." Damien studied his advisor carefully, sensing the careful maneuvering beneath the reasonable-sounding words. What kind of complications do you anticipate, Varric? Only that the young woman is, after all, a commoner, with no formal training in royal protocol, Varric said smoothly. As the prince grows, his education and preparation for eventual rule will require considerations she may not be equipped to provide. Perhaps a transition toward more traditionally qualified tutors and caretakers, once his immediate crisis has stabilized, would serve the kingdom's long-term interests. She is not simply managing a crisis, Varric, Damien said, his voice carrying a firmness that left little room for argument. She is healing my son in ways no formally trained physician or tutor ever managed to achieve. I have no intention of removing her from his life the moment his recovery becomes convenient for other arrangements. Varric bowed his head slightly, recognizing the futility of pressing the matter further in that particular moment. Of course, Your Majesty. I only wish to ensure the kingdom's best interests are properly considered as circumstances continue evolving. The conversation ended there, but Varric left the council chamber with his concerns only deepening. He resolved to watch the situation more closely in the weeks ahead, uncertain yet how precisely this development might threaten the careful political arrangements he had spent considerable effort cultivating, but certain enough that it warranted careful, deliberate attention. Unaware of these quiet political concerns stirring beneath the surface of the court, Illyra continued her patient work with Chaol, each day bringing small, meaningful progress that continued to astonish everyone who witnessed it. The garden walks became a regular part of their afternoon routine, gradually extending further along the winding paths, as Chaol's confidence grew alongside his curiosity about the world beyond his nursery walls. One particularly warm afternoon, as the last days of pleasant autumn weather lingered before winter's approach, Illyra brought a small collection of simple instruments to the garden, remnants of her own childhood, that she had carried with her from the farm, including a small wooden flute her father had carved for her many years earlier. She played a simple tune, watching Chaol's reaction carefully as the gentle notes drifted through the garden air. His eyes widened with obvious fascination, his attention completely captured by the unfamiliar sound, in a way Illyra had not witnessed since their earliest days together. When she finished the tune, she offered the flute toward him, watching curiously to see how he might respond. Chaol studied the instrument for a long moment, before reaching out carefully, accepting it with obvious reverence, turning it over in his small hands, to examine its careful craftsmanship. "Would you like to try?" Illyra asked gently. Chaol raised the flute to his lips, with clumsy uncertainty, attempting to mimic the way he had watched her hold it. The sound that emerged was little more than a breathy, uneven whistle, nothing resembling actual music, but his eyes lit with genuine delight at having produced any sound at all. Illyra laughed warmly, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both with its spontaneity. "That is a wonderful beginning," she said encouragingly. "Music takes practice, just like everything else worth learning." Chaol attempted the flute several more times, his uneven attempts gradually growing slightly more controlled with each try, though true musical skill would clearly require considerably more practice than a single afternoon could provide. Still, the simple joy radiating from his small face, as he experimented with the unfamiliar instrument, brought an unexpected warmth to Illyra's chest, a feeling that had become increasingly familiar during her weeks caring for this once wild, frightened child. Damien arrived partway through this scene, having taken to visiting the garden most afternoons when his duties allowed, and paused near the entrance to observe his son's clumsy but joyful attempts at music, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face, in a way that had grown increasingly common since Illyra's arrival, though it remained rare enough that the guards and servants who witnessed it still found themselves quietly remarking on the change in their king's demeanor. "He has never shown interest in music before," Damien observed, settling onto a nearby garden bench beside Illyra. "Perhaps he simply never had the right opportunity," Illyra replied, watching Chaol continue his enthusiastic, if unskilled experimentation, with obvious fondness. "Children often surprise us when given gentle space to discover what genuinely interests them, rather than only what we expect they should enjoy." Damien nodded thoughtfully, watching his son with an expression that carried equal parts pride and quiet wonder. "You have taught me more about my own child these past weeks than 3 years of desperate searching ever managed to reveal." "He has taught himself, Your Majesty," Illyra said gently. I have only tried to listen carefully enough to notice what he was already trying to show us." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching Cale's continued enthusiastic if imperfect musical attempts, two adults bound together by shared devotion to a child's healing, neither yet willing to fully acknowledge the deeper connection quietly growing between them, alongside that shared purpose. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward evening, casting long golden shadows across the garden path, Damien found himself studying Alira's profile, as she watched Cale with obvious tenderness, noticing details he had not permitted himself to notice before: the gentle curve of her smile, the quiet strength evident in her steady, patient demeanor, the genuine warmth radiating from every interaction she shared with his troubled, grieving son. He looked away quickly when she turned toward him, uncertain how to process the unfamiliar stirring of feeling taking root within his careful, guarded heart, a heart he had believed permanently closed since the loss of his beloved wife 3 long years earlier. Whatever these feelings meant, whatever complications they might eventually create within a court already watching this unfolding story with increasing interest, Damien decided, for now at least, to simply allow himself the quiet comfort of these peaceful afternoons, uncertain what the future held, but grateful, more than words could properly express, for the healing that had finally begun within the walls of his long grieving home. As winter approached and the garden's colorful blooms gave way to bare branches and frosted mornings, Cale and Alira moved their daily routine back indoors, though the progress achieved during those autumn afternoons remained firmly intact. He had begun making small sounds more frequently now, not quite words, but clear attempts at communication, humming along with familiar tunes, offering soft murmurs of contentment or mild protest depending on his mood. One quiet evening, as snow began falling gently outside the nursery window, Alira noticed Cale studying her with unusual intensity while she prepared his bed for the evening. His golden eyes, so expressive despite his continued silence, seemed to carry a question he did not yet know how to voice. "What is it?" she asked softly, settling beside him. Cale reached toward the small wooden wolf carving that remained permanently on his bedside table now, picking it up carefully and turning it over in his hands before extending it toward her, a questioning expression crossing his young face. Alira accepted the carving gently, studying its careful craftsmanship. "Your father made this, didn't he?" Cale nodded, the first clear, deliberate gesture of confirmation he had offered, in response to a direct question, since Alira's arrival months earlier. "He must love you very much," Alira said softly, "to have made something so carefully just for you." Cale's small hand reached toward his chest, resting briefly over his heart, before pointing toward the carving, then toward the window, then making a small, careful gesture that Alira slowly realized represented someone singing, fingers moving gently near his throat. Understanding dawned slowly. "Your mother," Alira said quietly. "She used to sing to you, didn't she, while your father made things like this for you?" Cale's eyes filled with sudden tears, the first genuine display of grief Alira had witnessed from him since her arrival, though it lacked the frightened, defensive quality of his earlier outbursts. This was simply sorrow, honest and unguarded, finally finding a small measure of safe expression after years of being locked away behind silence and fear. Alira moved closer, wrapping her arms gently around his small, trembling shoulders, careful not to hold too tightly, allowing him the choice to lean into the embrace or pull away as he needed. Cale leaned into her fully, his small body shaking with quiet sobs that had clearly been suppressed for far too long. "It is all right to miss her," Alira whispered softly, rocking him gently as she continued humming the familiar lullaby between words. "It is all right to feel sad. Missing someone we love does not mean we are broken. It simply means we love them very much, and that love does not disappear just because they are no longer with us." They remained like that for a long while, Cale's tears gradually subsiding into quiet, exhausted stillness, Alira continuing her gentle humming until his breathing finally evened into peaceful sleep against her shoulder. She carried him carefully to his bed, tucking him in gently, before settling into the chair beside him, watching over his peaceful rest with quiet tenderness, understanding that something significant had shifted that evening. A door long sealed shut, finally beginning to creak open toward genuine healing, rather than mere management of his grief. The following morning, Elira relayed the evening's events to Beatrice, who listened with quiet astonishment, recognizing immediately the significance of what had transpired. "He has never allowed himself to grieve openly before," Beatrice said softly. "Not once, in 3 years. Every healer who examined him noted the same troubling pattern: grief, locked away so tightly it had nowhere left to go except outward, into fear and aggression. Perhaps he simply needed to feel safe enough to let it out properly," Elira suggested. "Rather than being told to be brave or to move past it quickly, as I suspect the earlier caretakers, however well-intentioned, may have encouraged." Beatrice nodded slowly, considering this insight carefully. "You have accomplished something remarkable here, Elira. I hope you understand the true magnitude of what you have given this family." When Damien learned of the previous evening's events, he found himself deeply moved, though also carrying a familiar ache of his own grief that Cale's tears had inevitably stirred within him as well. He visited the nursery that afternoon, finding his son quieter than usual, but noticeably calmer, his earlier tears seeming to have released some long-held tension that had gripped him for years. "I heard you had a difficult evening," Damien said gently, settling beside his son on the floor. Cale studied his father for a long moment before reaching for his hand, a small but deliberate gesture of connection that caught Damien entirely off guard. He had not initiated physical contact with his father in longer than he could properly remember. Overwhelmed with quiet emotion, Damien carefully closed his fingers around his son's small hand, holding it gently, unwilling to disturb whatever fragile trust had prompted this precious gesture. "I miss her too," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 long years of carefully suppressed grief. "Every single day. But I am so proud of you, Cale. So very proud of how brave you have been." Cale leaned against his father's side, resting his head against Damien's arm, and for the first time since Leora's passing, father and son sat together in comfortable, healing silence, united not by shared trauma alone, but by the beginning of genuine, shared recovery. Elira watched this tender scene from a respectful distance near the doorway, her heart swelling with quiet joy at witnessing the family finally beginning to heal together. She understood that her own role, while significant, was only part of a much larger process, one that ultimately depended on the love already present between father and son, love that had simply needed a safe path back to genuine expression after being buried beneath years of grief and fear. As she watched Damien gently comfort his son, she found her own thoughts drifting unexpectedly toward the growing warmth she felt whenever the king was near, a warmth she had been carefully, deliberately ignoring for weeks now, uncertain what to make of feelings that seemed increasingly difficult to dismiss as simple professional respect. She reminded herself firmly of her position within this castle, a hired caretaker, nothing more, tending to a grieving prince whose father remained, in the eyes of the court and the kingdom, still deeply bound to the memory of his beloved late wife. Whatever quiet feelings stirred within her own heart, she resolved, had no place interfering with the important healing work still ahead for this fragile, recovering family. Yet even as she made this careful resolution, she could not entirely dismiss the warmth that had settled, quietly and persistently, somewhere deep within her own long-guarded heart. That night, unable to sleep, Elira found herself thinking back to the difficult months following her own parents' passing, memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit fully. She remembered the fever that had swept through their small village during the harshest weeks of winter, taking both her mother and father within days of one another, leaving her suddenly responsible for a grieving younger brother and a struggling farm she barely understood how to manage. She remembered the well-meaning neighbors who had urged her to remain strong, to set aside her own grief in order to care for Finn, advice that, however kindly intended, had left her feeling as though her sorrow had no acceptable place to exist. She had learned, during those difficult months, to grieve quietly in stolen moments, late at night after Finn had fallen asleep, when no one remained to witness or judge the depth of her own private sorrow. Perhaps that was precisely why she had recognized so clearly what Cale needed, the safe space to grieve without judgment, without pressure to appear strong or recovered before he was genuinely ready. She had needed exactly that same permission herself, and had rarely received it from those around her during her own difficult season of loss. She thought of her mother's gentle voice, the lullabies that had carried her through countless difficult nights, and found herself grateful, in a strange and unexpected way, that her own grief had prepared her to offer this small, grieving prince the understanding he desperately needed. The following weeks brought continued gentle progress. Cale began attempting small sounds more frequently now, simple syllables that were not quite words but represented clear attempts at verbal communication. One afternoon, as Alira helped him arrange a new collection of colorful autumn leaves he had gathered during a garden walk, he pointed toward a particularly bright red leaf and made a soft, halting sound. "Leaf," Alira said gently, encouraging without pressuring. "That is a leaf, Cale. A very pretty one, too." Cale studied her mouth carefully as she spoke, then attempted the word himself, his pronunciation clumsy and uncertain, barely resembling the actual word, but unmistakably an attempt at genuine speech. "Le," he managed, his golden eyes widening with obvious surprise at his own accomplishment. Alira could not contain her joyful smile, clapping her hands together softly in gentle celebration. "Yes, exactly right. Leaf. You said it, Cale." Cale's face broke into a small, tentative smile, the first genuine smile Alira had witnessed from him in her entire time at the castle, a rare and precious sight that brought unexpected tears of joy to her own eyes. Word of this small breakthrough spread through the castle with the same speed as every other milestone in Cale's recovery, bringing genuine celebration among the staff who had watched his transformation unfold with growing wonder over the preceding months. Even Beatrice, normally so measured in her reactions, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile upon hearing the news. When Damien learned that his son had spoken his first word in over 3 years, he could not contain the emotion that overwhelmed him entirely. He rushed to the nursery immediately upon hearing the news, finding Cale still practicing the word with quiet determination, repeating it softly to himself as he examined the colorful leaf collection spread before him. "Le," Cale said again, as his father entered, holding up the red leaf proudly for Damien to see. "Leaf," Damien repeated softly, kneeling beside his son, with tears streaming freely down his face. Tears he made no attempt to hide in this precious, overwhelming moment. "That is wonderful, Cale. Absolutely wonderful." Cale, seeing his father's tears but understanding somehow that they represented joy rather than sorrow, reached up and gently touched his father's cheek, a small gesture of comfort that nearly undid Damien entirely, overwhelmed as he was by the depth of healing finally taking root within his long-broken family. That evening, after Cale had finally settled into peaceful sleep, Damien found Alira in the quiet corridor outside the nursery, preparing to retire for the evening herself. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the overwhelming emotion from earlier that day. "You have given me back a son I feared I had lost forever." "He gave himself back," Alira replied gently. "I only offered him a safe path to find his way there." Damien studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded softening his expression entirely. "Whatever you call it, I am more grateful than words can properly express, and I find myself increasingly aware," he continued, his voice growing quieter, more hesitant, "that my gratitude extends toward more than simply your care for my son." Alira felt her heart quicken at his words, uncertain how to respond to the vulnerability evident in his careful admission. Before she could formulate any reply, however, a servant approached hurriedly from down the corridor, interrupting the moment with urgent news requiring the king's immediate attention. Damien excused himself reluctantly, offering Alira a lingering glance before following the servant toward whatever pressing matter awaited him, leaving Alira alone in the quiet corridor, her heart still racing from words left unfinished, wondering what exactly the king had been about to say, and equally uncertain what her own answer might have been, had he found the chance to finish it. The urgent matter that had called Damien away that evening turned out to be the arrival of a delegation from the neighboring kingdom of Thornwell, a visit that had been planned for months as part of ongoing negotiations regarding trade agreements and, more significantly, a potential political marriage between King Damien and Lady Cassandra Thornwell, daughter of the neighboring kingdom's ruler. Lord Varric had been quietly cultivating this arrangement for nearly a year, recognizing the strategic advantages a union between the two kingdoms would provide, strengthening border security and opening valuable trade routes that had remained closed for generations due to old territorial disputes between their respective families. Until recently, Damien had approached the matter with the detached practicality expected of a king, managing the affairs of his kingdom, viewing the potential marriage as a reasonable political arrangement, rather than any genuine romantic consideration, his heart still too firmly bound to his late wife's memory to consider remarriage in any emotional sense. But something had shifted within him over recent months, a shift Varric had observed with growing concern, as the king's demeanor toward the young nursery caretaker grew increasingly warm, increasingly personal, in ways that extended well beyond simple gratitude for his son's remarkable recovery. The Thornwell delegation's arrival, therefore, carried considerably more tension than Varric had originally anticipated when first arranging the visit months earlier. Lady Cassandra herself proved to be a composed, intelligent young woman, clearly well prepared for the political nature of this potential arrangement, though she carried herself with a warmth that suggested genuine hope for something more than mere political convenience might eventually develop between herself and the king she had traveled so far to meet. During the formal banquet held to welcome the delegation, Damien found himself distracted throughout much of the evening, his attention repeatedly drawn toward thoughts of the nursery upstairs, wondering how Cale's evening routine was progressing without his usual presence, wondering, though he tried carefully not to dwell on it during this politically significant occasion, what Alira might be doing at that very moment. Lady Cassandra, perceptive despite her relative youth, noticed the king's occasional distraction throughout their conversation, though she attributed it graciously to the considerable pressures of managing a kingdom rather than any personal disinterest in their meeting. "I understand your son has made remarkable progress recently," she mentioned during a lull in their conversation. "The news has reached even our own kingdom's court. It must bring you tremendous relief." "It does," Damien said, his expression warming genuinely for the first time that evening. "More relief than I can properly express." He spoke his first word just this week, after 3 years of complete silence. "That is wonderful news indeed," Cassandra replied warmly. "I understand a young caretaker deserves considerable credit for this transformation." "She does," Damien said, perhaps with more enthusiasm than the formal setting entirely warranted, catching Varric's sharp, watchful glance from across the banquet hall. Varric, seated nearby, listened to this exchange with growing unease, recognizing immediately the danger this careless enthusiasm posed to carefully cultivated diplomatic plans. He resolved to address the matter directly, before rumors and observations from the visiting delegation created complications that might jeopardize the entire arrangement he had spent considerable effort constructing. Following the banquet, Varric requested a private audience with the king, using the pretense of discussing trade logistics, before gradually steering the conversation toward more delicate matters. The Thornwell delegation seemed pleased with this evening's proceedings. Varric began carefully. Lady Cassandra, in particular, expressed considerable interest in continuing discussions regarding the proposed arrangement. "I noticed," Damien replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I could not help but observe, however, Your Majesty, a certain distraction during your conversation with her. Perhaps concerns regarding the prince's welfare, or other pressing matters?" Damien regarded his advisor carefully, sensing the deliberate probing beneath the seemingly casual observation. "The prince is well cared for, Varric. You need not concern yourself with distractions that do not exist." "Of course, Your Majesty," Varric said, though his tone carried the subtle persistence of a man unwilling to abandon a point he considered important. "I only wish to ensure this significant arrangement receives your full attention. The kingdom's security depends considerably on its successful completion." "I am fully aware of the kingdom's needs, Varric," Damien said, a note of warning entering his voice. "You need not remind me of my responsibilities." Varric bowed his head, recognizing the conversation had reached its natural limit for the evening, though his concerns remained entirely unresolved. He resolved, as he departed the king's private chambers that evening, that more direct action might soon prove necessary to protect the delicate arrangement from whatever distraction had begun claiming an increasingly troubling share of the king's attention. Over the following days, whispers began circulating through the castle's more politically minded circles, whispers carefully seeded by Varric's subtle influence among certain courtiers, eager to align themselves with his favor. These rumors painted Alira in increasingly unflattering terms, suggesting she had deliberately cultivated closeness with the young prince as a calculated strategy to secure her own position and influence within the royal household, perhaps even harboring ambitions toward the king himself, that extended well beyond her humble origins. Nora, who had grown genuinely fond of Alira since their earlier encounter following her injury, overheard several of these unkind whispers among the kitchen staff one afternoon, and felt compelled to warn her friend of the unfair rumors circulating. "They are saying terrible things," Nora said quietly, finding Alira during a brief break from her nursery duties. "That you have manipulated the young prince's affection deliberately. That you seek to trap the king through his son's recovery." Alira felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at these unfair accusations. "That is absurd," she said, though worry crept into her voice, despite her attempt at composure. "I have only tried to help him heal." "I know that," Nora said sympathetically. "Everyone who has genuinely witnessed your work with him knows that. But rumors, once started, travel far faster than truth ever manages to catch up with them." Alira thanked Nora for the warning, though the unfair accusations weighed heavily on her mind throughout the remainder of the day, coloring her interactions with a caution she had not previously felt necessary within these castle walls. She found herself wondering, with growing unease, whether her position here might prove more precarious than she had allowed herself to consider during the peaceful, hopeful weeks since her arrival. That evening, as she prepared Kale for bed, her distraction was evident enough that even the young prince noticed, tugging gently at her sleeve with a questioning expression. "I am all right," she reassured him softly, though her smile carried less genuine warmth than usual. "Simply tired this evening." Kale studied her carefully, his growing emotional awareness allowing him to sense the falseness in her reassurance, though he lacked the verbal skills yet to properly question her further. Instead, he simply leaned against her side, offering wordless comfort, in return for the countless times she had offered the same to him. Alira felt tears threaten unexpectedly at this small, precious gesture, grateful beyond words for the genuine bond she had built with this once frightened child, regardless of whatever unfair rumors certain members of the court chose to spread about her true intentions. Meanwhile, Lord Varric continued his careful campaign, arranging for select pieces of information, some accurate, others carefully exaggerated or distorted, to reach Lady Cassandra's traveling companions, before the Thornwell delegation departed for their return journey home. He hoped these carefully planted concerns might prompt increased urgency from the neighboring kingdom to finalize marriage negotiations quickly, before whatever distraction currently claiming the king's attention could develop into something more serious. His efforts, however, produced an effect he had not entirely anticipated. Rather than increased urgency, Lady Cassandra's traveling companions returned home, with growing uncertainty regarding the wisdom of pursuing a marriage arrangement with a king whose genuine affections appeared to lie elsewhere, uncertainty that would complicate, rather than accelerate the negotiations Varric had worked so carefully to advance. Unaware of these complicated political machinations unfolding around her, Alira continued her daily work with Kale, though the weight of unfair rumors and growing court scrutiny added a layer of quiet stress to what had otherwise become genuinely joyful, meaningful work. She found herself wondering, during quiet moments alone in her small chamber each evening, whether the growing warmth she felt toward the king, feelings she had tried so carefully to suppress and dismiss, might ultimately prove far more complicated and dangerous than she had initially allowed herself to consider. She thought of Finn, safely tucked away at Mrs. Hallow's home many miles distant, and wondered, with growing unease, whether the security and stability she had hoped to build for both of them here at Ashgrave Castle might prove considerably more fragile than the peaceful weeks of recent progress had allowed her to believe. The following morning brought new evidence of the growing tension surrounding her position. As she made her way toward the nursery, she overheard two unfamiliar nobles discussing her presence within the castle with open, unkind speculation, their voices carrying easily through the quiet corridor. "They say the king dotes on her far more than any hired caretaker warrants," one noble remarked with obvious disapproval. "A commoner, no less, with designs on the throne itself, if the rumors prove accurate." "Lord Varric suggests as much," the other agreed. Though whether the king recognizes the danger himself remains uncertain. Alira paused just beyond their view, her cheeks burning with a mixture of humiliation and quiet anger at these unfair, unfounded accusations. She had done nothing beyond her genuine, dedicated work caring for a grieving child, yet somehow, her simple compassion had been twisted into calculated ambition by those who understood nothing of the genuine bond she shared with young Kale. She continued on toward the nursery, with her composure carefully restored, determined not to allow unfair rumors to distract her from the important work still ahead. But the weight of growing court scrutiny settled more heavily upon her with each passing day, a quiet storm building steadily beneath the surface of the castle's otherwise hopeful atmosphere, one that would soon demand far more courage from her than simple patience and gentle songs alone could provide. That evening, unable to carry the weight of the unfair whispers entirely alone, Alira sought out Beatrice, finding the head housekeeper reviewing household accounts in her small office near the kitchens. "May I speak with you?" Alira asked hesitantly, standing in the doorway. Beatrice looked up immediately, noticing the troubled expression on the young woman's face. "Of course. Come in, sit." Alira settled into the chair across from Beatrice's desk, hesitating briefly, before finally giving voice to the concerns that had weighed on her throughout the day. "There are rumors circulating about me, that I have deliberately cultivated the prince's affection to secure influence within the castle, perhaps even to pursue the king himself." Beatrice's expression hardened slightly, though not toward Alira. "I have heard similar whispers myself. Lord Varric's influence, I suspect, though proving such things is rarely simple within a court so skilled at subtle maneuvering." "Why would he wish to harm my reputation?" Alira asked, genuinely puzzled. "I have done nothing except care for a child who needed help." "Politics rarely concerns itself with fairness," Beatrice said with a tired sigh. "Varric has spent considerable effort arranging a marriage between the king and a foreign noblewoman, an arrangement that serves the kingdom's strategic interests, and, I suspect, serves Varric's own influence within the court rather significantly as well. Your presence, and whatever feelings the king may be developing toward you, complicates those carefully laid plans." Alira absorbed this information slowly, understanding now the deeper political currents she had unknowingly waded into. "I never intended to complicate anything. I only wished to help Cale." "I know that," Beatrice said gently, "and so does anyone who has genuinely witnessed your work these past months. But I would be lying if I told you this will not grow more difficult before it grows easier. Court politics rarely favor those without noble blood or powerful allies, regardless of the genuine good they accomplish." "What would you have me do?" Alira asked quietly. Beatrice considered the question carefully before answering. "Continue your work, with the same integrity you have shown since your arrival. Do not allow unfair whispers to change who you are, or how you care for that child. Truth, even when it moves slower than rumor, eventually finds its way to light, provided those who know it remain steady enough to speak it when the moment requires courage." Alira nodded, drawing quiet strength from Beatrice's steady counsel, though the weight of the situation remained heavy on her mind as she made her way back toward her chamber that evening. Meanwhile, in his private study, King Damien had also become aware of the unkind rumors circulating through his court, information relayed to him by a loyal guard who had grown fond of Alira during her months of dedicated service to the young prince. Damien's anger at these unfair accusations burned hot and immediate. He summoned Varric to his study that very evening, his usually measured demeanor carrying a sharp edge that few within the castle had witnessed, directed toward his chief advisor. "I understand there are rumors circulating regarding Alira's intentions within this castle," Damien said without preamble, as Varric entered. "Rumors suggesting she seeks influence or position, through manipulation, rather than genuine care for my son." Varric maintained his composed expression, though something flickered briefly behind his careful eyes. "I have heard similar whispers, Your Majesty, though I could not say with certainty their origin." "Cannot, or will not," Damien pressed, his voice carrying dangerous quiet intensity. "I find it curious, Varric, that such rumors began circulating shortly after you expressed concerns regarding her position within this household. Your Majesty, I assure you, I have only ever sought the kingdom's best interests," Varric said carefully. "If certain courtiers have drawn their own conclusions regarding the young woman's growing closeness with yourself, I cannot control the natural speculation such circumstances inevitably invite. She has done nothing but heal my son through patience and genuine compassion," Damien said firmly. "I will not tolerate baseless accusations against her character, regardless of their source or their intended political purpose." "Of course not, Your Majesty," Varric replied smoothly, though his careful bow did little to mask the calculating thoughts clearly continuing behind his composed expression. I only hope, for the kingdom's sake, that personal matters do not overshadow the important strategic considerations still requiring your attention." Damien dismissed his advisor with a curt wave, remaining alone afterward, with his thoughts churning uncomfortably. He recognized clearly now the political complications his growing feelings toward Alira had introduced, complications that extended well beyond simple court gossip into matters of genuine strategic importance for his kingdom's security and prosperity. Yet even acknowledging these serious complications, he found he could not bring himself to regret the warmth and healing Alira had brought into his family's life, nor could he easily dismiss the deeper feelings that had grown steadily within his own long-guarded heart throughout the months of her dedicated service. He resolved, as he finally retired for the evening, to protect her from whatever unfair political machinations Varric or others within his court might continue attempting, regardless of the personal or political cost such protection might eventually demand of him. What he did not yet realize, as sleep finally claimed him that troubled night, was precisely how far Varric's concerns had already progressed, nor how directly and dangerously those concerns would soon threaten not only Alira's position within the castle, but the safety of the small, healing family she had worked so tirelessly to help rebuild. The following week brought a chill deeper than any previous winter morning, and with it, a crisis that would test everything Alira and Cale had carefully built together over the preceding months. It began with a summons, delivered to Alira's chamber early one morning, requesting her presence in a distant section of the castle, for what the messenger described only as an urgent administrative matter, requiring her immediate attention. Alira, though puzzled by the unusual request, followed the messenger dutifully, unaware that this summons had been carefully arranged by Varric himself, a deliberate attempt to separate her from the nursery, long enough to implement a more permanent solution to the complications her presence had introduced into his careful political plans. Left alone in the nursery under the supervision of a nervous young guard unfamiliar with his particular needs and temperament, Cale grew increasingly agitated as the morning progressed without Alira's expected presence. The guard, lacking any understanding of the careful patience Alira had spent months cultivating, attempted to manage the prince's growing distress through increasingly forceful commands, inadvertently triggering the very fears and defensive reactions that months of gentle care had worked so hard to overcome. By mid-morning, Cale's panic had escalated beyond the guard's ability to manage. In a moment of overwhelming fear, reverting to instincts that had protected him during his most difficult years, Cale fled the nursery entirely, slipping past the startled guard and disappearing into the castle's winding corridors before anyone could properly intervene. Word of the missing prince spread through the castle with alarming speed, sending guards and servants alike scrambling through every corridor and chamber in a desperate search for the frightened child. Beatrice, informed immediately of the crisis, sent an urgent messenger to retrieve Alira from wherever her mysterious summons had led her. Alira, meanwhile, had grown increasingly suspicious of the vague administrative matter she had been called to address, realizing quickly that the meeting bore all the signs of a deliberate delay rather than genuine urgent business. When the messenger finally reached her with news of Cale's disappearance, her heart dropped with immediate, overwhelming fear. "How long has he been missing?" she demanded, already moving swiftly back toward the nursery wing. "Nearly an hour, perhaps longer," the messenger replied, struggling to keep pace with her urgent stride. An hour was more than enough time for Cale, in his current state of terror, to have ventured into dangerous territory within the sprawling castle grounds, particularly given the treacherous winter weather that had settled over the region in recent days. Alira's mind raced through possibilities as she hurried through the castle corridors, recalling every conversation, every subtle clue Cale had offered during their months together that might indicate where a frightened, overwhelmed child might seek refuge. She remembered, suddenly, a conversation from several weeks earlier, when Cale had pointed excitedly toward the distant eastern woods visible from his nursery window, an area strictly forbidden to castle residents, due to its treacherous terrain and the wild animals known to inhabit its dense, ancient trees. Without waiting for official search parties to organize properly, Alira made the difficult decision to head directly toward the forbidden eastern woods herself, trusting her instinct despite the considerable danger such an unauthorized venture into dangerous territory represented. She informed a nearby guard of her intentions, ignoring his immediate objections regarding the danger and impropriety of venturing into forbidden territory without proper authorization or escort. "The prince may be in genuine danger," she said firmly. "I cannot wait for permission, while every passing moment increases that danger." The guard, recognizing the futility of arguing further with her evident determination, reluctantly agreed to accompany her, though he insisted on alerting additional guards to follow behind them as quickly as possible. The eastern woods proved even more treacherous than Alira had anticipated, dense undergrowth and icy patches making rapid movement difficult despite the urgency driving her forward. She called Kale's name repeatedly as she pushed deeper into the forest, her voice carrying clearly through the cold winter air, though no response answered her increasingly desperate calls. After nearly 30 minutes of difficult searching, as afternoon light began fading toward the early winter dusk, Alira finally spotted a small figure huddled beneath the sheltering branches of an ancient oak tree, trembling visibly from cold and lingering fear. "Kale," she called softly, careful not to startle him further as she approached slowly, mindful of the treacherous ice covering much of the forest floor around them. Kale looked up at the sound of her voice, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of relief and lingering terror. He did not run toward her immediately, his instinctive caution still firmly in control despite his obvious relief at her arrival, but he did not retreat further either, remaining still as she carefully closed the remaining distance between them. "You are safe now," Alira said softly, kneeling beside him despite the cold, wet ground soaking immediately through her simple dress. "I am here. You are safe." She began humming softly, the same familiar lullaby that had first bridged the gap between them so many months earlier, her voice carrying gently through the quiet, snow-dusted woods. Kale's trembling gradually eased as the familiar melody reached him, and after several long moments, he finally allowed himself to lean into her offered embrace, his small body shaking now more from released tension than continued fear. "I am sorry I was not there this morning," Alira said softly, holding him close against the bitter cold. "I promise you, I will always come back for you, always." As she prepared to guide him carefully back toward the castle, the sound of approaching movement through the dense underbrush caught her attention, followed immediately by several unfamiliar men emerging from between the trees, their expressions carrying a hardness that immediately raised Alira's guard. "You should not be here," one of the men said, his tone carrying an edge that had nothing to do with concern for their safety within the dangerous forest territory. "Lord Varric requires your immediate departure from Ashgrave Castle, effective today." Alira's blood ran cold with sudden understanding. These were not castle guards concerned for her safety, but men acting on Varric's direct orders, using the chaos of Kale's disappearance as cover for a far more dangerous agenda. "I will not leave the prince," she said firmly, positioning herself protectively between the approaching men and the frightened child still clinging to her side. "That is not your decision to make," the man replied coldly, gesturing for his companions to move forward. Kale, sensing the sudden danger, began trembling violently again, his small fingers gripping Alira's dress with desperate, frightened strength. Alira held him close, her mind racing desperately for any solution, as the men continued their slow, deliberate approach through the darkening forest. "The king will not permit this," she said, backing away carefully, while maintaining her protective stance over Kale. "You are acting against his direct wishes. The king need not know the specific details of how this situation resolves itself," the lead man replied, his implication carrying a dangerous edge that sent fresh fear through Alira's chest. "Only that his son was recovered safely, and that certain complications regarding his care were quietly resolved." Alira understood, with growing horror, that these men intended to remove her permanently from the castle, likely through means far more severe than a simple dismissal from her position. She glanced quickly around the darkening forest, searching desperately for any avenue of escape or rescue, finding none readily apparent as the men continued closing the remaining distance between them. Just as the lead man reached out to grasp her arm, the sound of thundering hooves and shouting voices erupted through the forest, followed immediately by the imposing figure of King Damien himself, mounted on his powerful war horse, several loyal guards close behind him, having finally caught up with the search party that had tracked Alira's earlier departure into the forbidden woods. Damien took in the scene before him in a single sweeping glance, understanding immediately the danger Alira and his son faced from the unfamiliar men surrounding them. His expression hardened into cold fury as he dismounted swiftly, striding forward with an authority that left no room for argument or hesitation. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice carrying easily through the quiet forest air, carrying the unmistakable weight of royal authority that immediately froze the approaching men in their tracks. "Explain yourselves immediately, or face consequences far more severe than whatever payment you were promised for this action." The lead man, recognizing the king's arrival, had entirely unraveled whatever plan Varric had carefully constructed, stumbled through a hasty explanation, claiming they had simply intended to escort the caretaker safely back toward the castle following the prince's disappearance, careful to avoid any mention of Varric's specific involvement or intentions. Damien did not believe a single word of this hastily constructed excuse, his sharp eyes immediately noting Alira's protective stance over his trembling son, the fear evident in her expression despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Guards, detain these men immediately. I will learn the truth of this matter personally, and anyone found responsible for endangering my son or threatening this young woman will face the full consequences of such treachery." The loyal castle guards moved swiftly to restrain the men, who offered little resistance against the king's clearly superior numbers and authority. Damien turned immediately toward Alira and Cale, his fierce expression softening entirely as he knelt beside them both. "Are you both unharmed?" he asked urgently, his hands reaching to steady Cale's still trembling shoulders. "We are safe now," Alira replied, though her own voice carried the lingering tremor of her recent fear. "Thank you for arriving when you did." Cale, recognizing his father's familiar presence, reached toward him with desperate relief, allowing Damien to gather him into a protective embrace that spoke volumes about the healing that had transformed their relationship over recent months. "I was so frightened when they told me you had gone missing," Damien murmured against his son's hair, holding him close. "Never again, do you understand? Never venture into danger alone again." Cale nodded against his father's shoulder, still trembling slightly from the day's overwhelming events, though the presence of both his father and Alira together provided a comfort that gradually eased his lingering fear. Damien helped Alira to her feet, his hand lingering briefly against hers longer than perhaps strictly necessary, his expression carrying gratitude and something deeper that neither of them had yet found the courage to properly name. "I owe you an even greater debt now," he said quietly. "You risked your own safety to protect my son, and now, it seems, you have faced genuine danger, simply for the crime of caring for him properly." "I would do it again without hesitation," Alira replied firmly. "He is worth every risk." As the group made their way carefully back toward the castle through the deepening winter dusk, Damien's mind churned with cold fury, regarding the clear evidence that someone within his own court had orchestrated this dangerous scheme against Alira. He resolved with grim determination to uncover the full truth of the matter immediately upon their return, regardless of whatever political complications such an investigation might ultimately reveal. The detained men, questioned separately upon their return to the castle, eventually revealed, under the weight of the king's clear determination to learn the complete truth, that their orders had indeed originated from Lord Varric himself, who had promised generous payment in exchange for ensuring Alira's permanent removal from Ashgrave Castle before the current political negotiations with the Thornwell delegation could be further complicated by her continued presence. Damien received this confirmation with a controlled fury, more dangerous than any outward display of rage might have conveyed. He understood now, with complete clarity, the full extent of Varric's willingness to endanger both his son and the woman who had healed him, all in service of political ambitions that had clearly grown to outweigh any genuine loyalty to the king he claimed to serve. That evening, after ensuring Cale was safely settled and resting peacefully under Beatrice's careful watch, Damien summoned Varric to the throne room, his expression carrying a coldness that immediately signaled the seriousness of the confrontation about to unfold. Word of the day's dramatic events had already spread rapidly through the castle, and the assembled guards and select witnesses present understood clearly that whatever followed would mark a significant turning point in the ongoing tension that had been quietly building within the court for weeks. Alira, recovering in her own chamber from the day's harrowing events, remained unaware of the confrontation now unfolding, though she sensed, with quiet certainty, that the careful peace she had worked so hard to build within these castle walls had reached a critical turning point that would determine not only her own future, but the future of the healing family she had come to love as deeply as her own. The throne room felt colder than usual as Varric entered, summoned so abruptly that he had not yet learned the full extent of what the king had already discovered. He approached the throne with his usual composed confidence, though something in the tense atmosphere of the room, the grim expressions of the assembled guards, the cold fury evident in Damien's rigid posture, suggested immediately that this would prove no ordinary evening meeting. "You summoned me, Your Majesty," Varric said, offering his customary bow, though his voice carried a faint uncertainty he could not entirely mask. "I did," Damien replied, his voice carrying a controlled coldness that immediately silenced the quiet murmurs among the assembled witnesses. "Perhaps you can explain to me why several men, acting under your direct orders, attempted to remove Elira from my castle by force today, endangering both her safety and that of my own son in the process." Varric's composed expression faltered visibly for the first time, though he attempted, with the practiced skill of a lifelong courtier, to recover his careful facade. "Your Majesty, I am uncertain what you have been told, but I assure you, do not insult me further with false denials," Damien interrupted sharply, rising from his throne to stand directly before his advisor. "The men you hired have already confessed the full truth of your involvement. I know precisely what you attempted to arrange, and precisely why you believed such treachery served the kingdom's interests." The assembled witnesses within the throne room fell into complete, tense silence, watching this dramatic confrontation unfold between the king and his once trusted advisor. Varric, recognizing finally that denial would serve no further purpose, straightened his posture with what remaining dignity he could muster. "Your Majesty, everything I have done for the genuine benefit of this kingdom," he said, his tone shifting from careful denial toward something closer to defensive justification. "The marriage arrangement with Thornwell would have secured our borders and opened trade routes our kingdom has needed for generations. Your growing attachment to a common caretaker threatened to unravel negotiations I had spent considerable effort constructing for the genuine good of this entire realm. So you believed endangering my son's safety and threatening genuine harm against the woman who has healed him more completely than any physician or advisor within this entire kingdom somehow served the greater good," Damien said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "You believed treachery against your own king, justified by whatever political calculations you had convinced yourself represented wisdom, rather than simple, selfish ambition." "I never intended genuine harm toward the prince," Varric protested, though his voice carried less conviction now. "Only her removal, quietly, before." "Before what, Varric?" Damien demanded. "Before I could recognize genuine goodness when it finally entered these long grieving halls? Before my son could finally heal from wounds that nearly destroyed him entirely? You gambled with my son's continued recovery and Elira's very safety, all to preserve political arrangements that served your own influence within this court as much as any genuine benefit to this kingdom." Varric said nothing further, recognizing the futility of continued argument against the king's controlled, righteous fury. The assembled witnesses watched in tense silence, understanding they were witnessing the complete unraveling of a once powerful advisor's carefully constructed influence within the royal court. "You will be stripped of your position and title immediately," Damien declared, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "You will be escorted from these castle grounds by morning, and you will never again hold any position of influence within this kingdom's court. Consider yourself fortunate that I choose banishment rather than the far more severe punishment your treachery genuinely warrants." Varric, understanding the completeness of his downfall, offered no further protest, allowing the guards to escort him from the throne room with what remained of his dignity, carefully, if barely, intact. The assembled witnesses watched his departure with a mixture of shock and quiet vindication, many having long suspected the depth of his political ambitions, but never fully anticipating the extent to which he might act upon them. Once Varric had been removed from the throne room, Damien addressed the remaining assembled court members directly, his expression softening slightly from its earlier controlled fury into something more openly emotional than the gathered nobles had witnessed from their king in longer than they could properly recall. "I know rumors have circulated regarding Elira's position within this castle," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet throne room. unkind whispers suggesting calculated ambition or manipulation on her part. I wish to address these rumors directly and completely, before this entire court, so that no doubt or unfair speculation remains regarding the truth of her character or her contributions to this royal family. He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully before continuing. For 3 years, my son suffered in silence, trapped within grief, so profound that 11 trained caretakers, each carefully selected and thoroughly experienced, failed to reach him despite their genuine efforts. Elira arrived at this castle with nothing beyond her own humble compassion and understanding, and within months, accomplished what our entire kingdom's resources had failed to achieve across 3 difficult years. He continued, his voice growing steadily more emotional as he spoke. She has given my son back his voice, his laughter, his ability to trust and connect with those around him. She did this not through calculated ambition, but through genuine, patient love for a child who desperately needed exactly that. Today, she risked her own safety to protect him from danger, venturing alone into forbidden territory, without hesitation, when his welfare required such courage. The assembled nobles listened with rapt attention, many exchanging glances that suggested growing understanding of the true depth of what had transpired within the royal nursery over recent months, understanding that shifted considerably from the unfair rumors that had circulated so carelessly through their ranks. I will not tolerate further unkind speculation regarding her character or her intentions, Damien continued firmly. She has earned this kingdom's genuine gratitude and respect, and I expect this court to extend both toward her, effective immediately. Beatrice, standing quietly among the assembled witnesses, felt tears of genuine relief and pride gathering in her eyes, having watched this entire difficult situation unfold with growing concern over recent weeks. She had believed firmly in Elira's genuine character since witnessing her patient dedication toward young Kale, and hearing the king himself defend her so completely, before the entire court, brought a profound sense of vindication. Later that evening, once the throne room had emptied and the castle had settled into its usual quiet nighttime rhythm, Damien made his way toward Elira's chamber, finding her still awake, seated near her small window, watching the stars that had witnessed so much of this remarkable story unfold since her arrival many months earlier. "May I speak with you?" he asked softly, standing at her open doorway. Elira turned, offering a tired but genuine smile at his familiar voice. "Of course, Your Majesty." Damien entered slowly, settling into the simple chair near her small writing desk, studying her carefully in the soft candlelight. "I have addressed the matter of Varric's treachery before the entire court this evening. He has been stripped of his position and banished from these grounds permanently." Elira absorbed this information with quiet relief, though her expression carried lingering exhaustion from the day's difficult events. "Thank you for protecting us both. I should have recognized his growing threat sooner," Damien said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "I allowed political considerations to blind me toward the danger he represented, danger that nearly cost me both my son's safety and yours." "You arrived when it mattered most," Elira said gently. "That is what matters." Damien studied her for a long, quiet moment, something vulnerable and unguarded finally breaking through his carefully composed royal demeanor. "I have tried, these past months, to convince myself that my feelings toward you were simply gratitude, simple appreciation for the healing you have brought into my son's life. But I can no longer honestly maintain that pretense, Elira. What I feel toward you extends far beyond simple gratitude." Elira's heart quickened at his words, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed weeks earlier, before their conversation was interrupted, finally finding its way toward complete, honest expression. "I have felt the same, though I did not believe it was my place to speak of such feelings, given everything at stake within this court, within your kingdom's important political considerations. Political considerations matter far less to me now than they once did," Damien said quietly, reaching gently for her hand. "I spent 3 years believing I would never again feel genuine warmth toward another person, that my heart remained too firmly bound to grief to ever consider such possibilities. You have proven that belief entirely wrong, both through your healing of my son and through the quiet, persistent warmth you have brought into my own long-guarded heart." Elira felt tears gather in her eyes, overwhelmed by the genuine emotion evident in his careful words. "I did not come to this castle seeking anything beyond honest work and fair wages," she said softly. I never imagined I might find something so much more precious than either." Damien raised her hand gently to his lips, a tender gesture that carried far more meaning than any elaborate declaration might have conveyed. "Whatever challenges still lie ahead, whatever political complications my choice might eventually create, I find I no longer wish to deny what has grown so genuinely between us these past months." They remained together for a while longer that evening, speaking quietly of the future neither of them had dared imagine when Alira first arrived at these castle gates so many months earlier, uncertain then of anything beyond her own determination to help a struggling family however she could, never anticipating the profound way that determination would ultimately transform her own life alongside theirs. News of Varric's dramatic downfall and the king's public defense of Alira spread through the castle with even greater speed than the earlier unkind rumors had managed, and by the following morning, the entire mood among the household staff had shifted entirely. Those who had whispered unkind speculation now found themselves quietly reconsidering their earlier judgments, while those who had always believed in Alira's genuine character felt a satisfying sense of vindication. Nora found Alira in the kitchen that morning, sharing a rare quiet breakfast with Mira before beginning her daily duties with Kale. "I heard everything that happened," Nora said, settling beside her with obvious relief. "I am so glad you are safe, and so pleased the truth has finally come to light." "I could not have managed any of it without friends like you," Alira replied warmly, grateful for the genuine support that had sustained her through the difficult recent weeks. Mira, setting a fresh plate of warm bread before them, nodded with satisfied approval. "I always said that man's ambitions ran deeper than his loyalty. Good riddance to him, and good fortune to you, dear girl. You have earned every bit of happiness coming your way." Word also reached Lady Cassandra Thornwell and her delegation before their departure, delivered through a carefully worded letter from Damien himself, explaining honestly the circumstances that had led to Varric's downfall, and acknowledging directly that his own heart had grown attached elsewhere during recent months. Lady Cassandra, gracious despite any personal disappointment, replied with genuine understanding, expressing hope that trade negotiations between their two kingdoms might still proceed successfully on their own separate merits. Without the added complication of a marriage, neither party had entered with genuine romantic expectation in the first place. This resolution, achieved without lasting damage to the important diplomatic relationship between the two kingdoms, brought Damien considerable relief, confirming that his choice to follow his own genuine feelings need not come at the cost of his kingdom's broader strategic interests after all. Within the nursery, Kale sensed the shifted atmosphere throughout the castle immediately, though he lacked full understanding of the political complexities that had unfolded the previous evening. He noticed, with growing curiosity, the warmth passing between his father and Alira whenever they were together now, an openness neither of them had previously displayed so freely in his presence. One afternoon, as the three of them shared a quiet moment together in the nursery, Kale studied his father and Alira with careful, thoughtful attention, before pointing first toward Damien, then toward Alira, then bringing his small hands together in a simple, deliberate gesture of joining. Damien and Alira exchanged a warm, surprised glance at his perceptive observation. "What do you think of that idea?" Damien asked his son gently, kneeling beside him. Kale nodded enthusiastically, his golden eyes bright with genuine excitement at the possibility his young mind had clearly already begun considering. He reached for both their hands, pulling them gently together, with insistent, joyful determination, his small face breaking into the wide, genuine smile that had become increasingly common since his remarkable recovery began. "I believe he approves," Alira said warmly, laughing softly at the child's enthusiastic matchmaking attempt. "He has always shown remarkable wisdom," Damien replied, his own expression carrying equal parts amusement and genuine tenderness. "For someone so young." As winter deepened around Ashgrave Castle, the small, healing family continued settling into their newfound happiness, each day bringing further evidence of Kale's remarkable recovery, alongside the deepening bond between Damien and Alira. The castle itself seemed to reflect this transformation, its usually somber winter atmosphere gradually warming with genuine laughter and music that had been notably absent throughout the difficult years following Queen Leora's passing. Alira received word from Mrs. Hallow that Finn continued thriving under her care, and with Damien's genuine encouragement, arrangements were soon made to bring her young brother to Ashgrave Castle permanently, ensuring that Elira need no longer choose between her growing responsibilities within the royal household and her devoted care for her remaining family. When Finn finally arrived at the castle gates several weeks later, wide-eyed with wonder at the grand stone towers and bustling activity surrounding him, Kale greeted him with immediate, enthusiastic curiosity, the two boys forming an easy, natural friendship within days that brought Elira profound joy, watching her beloved brother finally find the stability and security she had worked so tirelessly to provide him. The castle staff, having witnessed the entire remarkable transformation unfold across these many months, found themselves genuinely invested in the continued happiness of this healing royal family, their earlier fears regarding the once wild young prince having long since given way to genuine affection and pride regarding his remarkable, hard-won recovery. As the final weeks of winter gradually gave way toward the first gentle signs of approaching spring, King Damien made a decision he had been carefully considering since that difficult, transformative evening when he finally spoke honestly of his growing feelings toward Elira. He resolved to formalize their bond permanently, choosing genuine love and hard-won happiness over whatever political convenience alternative arrangements might have theoretically provided. He began quietly making preparations for what would become the most significant announcement Ashgrave Castle had witnessed in generations, one that would finally, completely transform the once grieving kingdom into a place of genuine hope and celebrated happiness. Spring arrived at Ashgrave Castle with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the profound healing that had taken place within its walls over the preceding months. The gardens, once carefully maintained only for their private, therapeutic purpose during Kale's recovery, now bloomed vibrantly across the castle grounds, preparing for what would soon become the most celebrated occasion the kingdom had witnessed in many years. Damien had formally proposed to Elira on a mild evening in early spring, choosing the same quiet garden path where Kale had taken his first tentative steps beyond the nursery walls many months earlier, a location carrying profound significance for the healing journey that had brought them all together. Elira had accepted with genuine, overwhelming joy, tears of happiness mixing freely with laughter, as Kale, present for the occasion, at his own insistent request, danced excitedly around them both, finally able to express his joy through both movement and increasingly confident words. News of the upcoming royal wedding spread quickly throughout the kingdom, carrying with it the remarkable story of a humble farmer's daughter who had healed a broken prince and captured a grieving king's genuine heart through nothing more than patience, compassion, and the simple gift of song. The story captured the imagination of common folk and nobility alike, offering proof that genuine goodness and quiet strength could triumph over political calculation and unfair prejudice regarding humble origins. The wedding day itself arrived on a beautiful morning in late spring, the castle grounds transformed with fragrant flowers and joyful decorations celebrating the remarkable union about to take place. Elira, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that reflected her own genuine, unpretentious character, rather than elaborate royal tradition, walked through the castle gardens toward where Damien waited, his expression carrying open, unguarded joy that had been entirely absent from his demeanor during the difficult years before her arrival. Kale, serving proudly in his own small role within the ceremony, carried a simple wooden box containing the rings that would soon bind his father and beloved caretaker together permanently. His golden eyes, once so guarded and fearful, now carried nothing but genuine happiness as he watched the two people who had rebuilt his broken world finally commit themselves to building a shared future together. Finn, standing proudly among the assembled guests alongside Beatrice, Mira, Nora, and countless other castle staff who had witnessed this remarkable transformation unfold, felt tremendous pride watching his sister's genuine happiness, understanding fully now the profound journey that had brought them both to this joyful, unexpected place. As the ceremony concluded and Damien gently kissed his new bride before the assembled celebration of nobles and common folk alike, Kale, standing close beside them both, reached for Elira's hand with his other hand still clasped firmly in his father's grip, forming a small, complete circle of family that represented everything this once broken household had fought so hard to reclaim. That evening, as the wedding celebration continued with music, dancing, and genuine joyful laughter echoing through halls that had known only somber silence for far too many years, Elira found a quiet moment to sit beside Kale near the edge of the celebration, watching the festivities with the same patient warmth that had first drawn them together so many months earlier. "Are you happy?" she asked him softly, though she already knew the answer from the genuine contentment evident in his relaxed, peaceful expression. Kale nodded, then, with the growing confidence that had developed steadily since his first hesitant word months earlier, spoke clearly and deliberately, his voice carrying none of the fear or hesitation that had once made speech feel impossible. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying profound weight given the long, difficult journey required to reach this precious moment of open, genuine expression. Elira felt tears of overwhelming joy fill her eyes as she pulled him into a warm embrace. "I love you too, Kale. More than I ever imagined possible when I first arrived at these castle gates." Damien joined them a moment later, settling beside his new family with an expression of profound, peaceful contentment that had been entirely foreign to him during the long, difficult years of grief that preceded Elira's transformative arrival. He wrapped his arms gently around both his son and his beloved new wife, watching the joyful celebration continuing around them, with genuine gratitude for the remarkable healing that had finally restored happiness to his long grieving home. "Every maid who came before you feared him," Damien said softly, watching his son's peaceful, genuine smile with quiet wonder. "They saw only wildness and fear, nothing beyond the surface of his grief. You alone saw the frightened child beneath that wildness, and loved him patiently enough to help him find his way back toward genuine healing." "He was never truly wild," Elira replied gently, watching Kale continue smiling with genuine, unguarded happiness beside them. "He was simply grieving in the only way he knew how, waiting patiently for someone willing to sit beside him long enough to understand what he truly needed." As the stars began emerging over Ashgrave Castle that peaceful spring evening, casting their familiar gentle light over gardens that had witnessed so much healing and transformation throughout the preceding months, the small family remained together, united finally in genuine, hard-won happiness that no political scheming or unfair rumor had ultimately managed to prevent. The castle that had once echoed with silence and fear now filled nightly with laughter, music, and the comfortable, contented sounds of a family finally whole again. Servants who had once feared entering the nursery now found themselves smiling whenever Kale's genuine laughter echoed through the castle corridors, a sound that had seemed impossible to imagine returning during those difficult years of grief and silence. Beatrice, watching the joyful wedding celebration continue late into the peaceful spring evening, felt profound satisfaction knowing that her small, hopeful decision to offer a humble farmer's daughter an uncertain position within the royal nursery had ultimately transformed not only one grieving child's life, but an entire kingdom's understanding of what genuine, patient love could accomplish, where fear, force, and political calculation had repeatedly failed. Years later, the story of the humble Omega, who had tamed a wild prince's grief through nothing more than patient songs and genuine compassion, would become a cherished tale told throughout the kingdom, a reminder that true healing required not force or fear, but simply the patient willingness to sit beside another's pain, long enough to help them find their way safely back toward hope, connection, and genuine, lasting happiness. Every maid before her had feared the wild young pup, seeing only danger and difficulty, where deeper understanding was truly required. But Elira had seen something entirely different from the very beginning, a frightened, grieving child, desperately waiting for someone patient enough to simply sit beside him and sing, until finally, gradually, genuine healing found its way home.